Welcome back to Dark Horror Narrations. I'm glad you're here tonight. If you're new to the channel, this is where we tell long, grounded encounter stories from the darker corners of the American map. Pipelines and pastures, lookout towers and well pads, the places where the country still gets quiet enough that the things pacing you in the tree line have room to work. Tonight I have 5 stories for you. 5 first-person accounts, 5 different jobs, 5 different pieces of country, and 1 creature that keeps finding new ways to get close. Every one of these is built to be listened to in the dark with your eyes closed. Pull the covers up, turn the lights down, let the voice do the work. Before we start, I have a question for you, and I want you to put the answer in the comments. Of all the places you've ever worked alone, or camped alone, or driven through alone, which one made the hair on the back of your neck stand up the most? Which one felt like something was watching? I read the comments. I promise you I do. Tell me where you were and what you felt. We'll build a list together of the places in this country that never quite feel empty, even when the map says they are. Now, get comfortable. Here we go. Story 1, The Right of Way. The methane sniffer was alarming on bare, frozen ground, where there was no pipe, no valve, no fitting, nothing underneath to leak. I watched the needle climb into the red, and whatever was pacing me through the tree line on the far side of the right-of-way wasn't breathing the same air I was. I need to back up, because, without the day leading into it, none of what followed makes sense. It was a Tuesday in the second week of January, 10 degrees at sunrise, wind out of the north, and I was 2 miles into a routine walk of a transmission line in the Four Corners country, where the state map still puts a line between the Pinon juniper and what gets called desert. The line I was walking was a 30-inch natural gas main that fed a compressor station at the north end and picked up a lateral off a gathering field in the south. My employer contracted for corrosion surveys 4 times a year on that segment. I had done it 8 times. It was one of the calmer routes on my list. The truck stayed on the service road. The service road runs parallel to the pipeline right-of-way, sometimes on top of it, sometimes alongside, depending on drainage and topography. On that stretch, the road sat about 40 yards west of the pipe, and the right-of-way itself had been cleared wide enough for a dozer to drive if they ever needed to dig. The cleared corridor ran straight through the pinon forest like a fire break, and from the middle of it I could see open sky in both directions for a quarter mile. My chase driver that day was a man named Luke. Luke had been with the company since he got out of the Marine Corps, which was about 8 years at that point, and he ran chase trucks the way he did everything else, which is to say he was awake and attentive from the moment he started the engine. He kept his window cracked even in 10-degree weather because he liked being able to hear me if I yelled, and he kept the radio volume low for the same reason. We were on a private channel, not county simplex. Repeater coverage was poor in that country, but line of sight was fine. Luke and I had worked that segment together for close to 3 years. We had a routine. He'd pick me up at the yard at 5:30. We'd stop at the gas station for coffee. I'd drive the first leg in the chase truck because he hated driving before first light. He'd take over at the first gate, and I'd suit up. By the time I was boots down on the right-of-way, the sun was usually cutting over the ridge to the east, and the frost on the sagebrush was starting to let go. We didn't talk much on the drive. We didn't need to. Neither of us were the kind of people who talked for the sake of it. He had a wife and a little girl in town. I had an ex-wife in Denver and a son who called me every other Sunday and didn't seem angry about anything, which I appreciated. Luke had a dog, a heeler mix named Piper, that rode in the chase truck on days when his wife was working. Piper wasn't with us that Tuesday. I remember that because Piper had come to the yard with him the previous week and had been friendly with me in a way that heelers generally are not, and I'd been a little disappointed she wasn't in the truck that morning. That's the kind of thing I remember. Not the weather report or what I had for breakfast, that the dog wasn't there. My gear was the standard loadout. Methane sniffer, laser version, calibrated the day before at the yard, cathodic protection voltmeter, GPS unit for marking any anomalies, paper topo, folded in the chest pocket under my jacket in case the GPS lost signal, which it did regularly in the canyons. Bear spray on my hip, even though bears weren't the concern at that elevation and that latitude in January. Small pack with water, a radio battery, a wool hat I wasn't wearing because the exertion kept me warm. Casio watch. Digital compass on my wrist because a physical compass holds up in cold better than a phone does. Boots were broken in. The work itself was simple. I walked the center line of the right-of-way. Sniffer held about hip-high, occasionally dropped closer to the ground where I had anomaly markers from the last survey. The sniffer beeps on a low chirp in normal operation. You stop noticing it after the first half hour. If it reaches a threshold of methane parts per million in ambient air, the chirp goes solid and the needle climbs, and you stop. You note your GPS coordinates, you turn and check for the nearest pipe marker, and you call it in to dispatch. The pipe markers are painted steel, driven into the ground at intervals along the right-of-way, usually every few hundred yards, but sometimes more often at road crossings and bends. They're painted yellow with black lettering, and they list the pipeline operator's emergency phone number and the approximate depth of bury, which for that segment was 36 inches. They're visible from a long distance in open country. They are also, by design, the reference markers you use to orient yourself when the sniffer or the GPS is acting up. The first 2 miles were routine. Sniffer chirping, frost on the scrub, my boots crunching through the thin crust where the shade from the tree line hadn't let the surface thaw. Luke paced me in the truck, sometimes visible through gaps in the pinion, sometimes not. Every 10 minutes or so I called in on the radio. He answered every call. He wasn't talkative, but he was consistent. The first time I felt something off, it was small enough that I wrote it down and kept walking. At a point about 2.25 miles in, I passed a set of boot prints in the snow crust that were parallel to my own and about 2 paces to my right. They were my size, which is 11. They had the same heel pattern as my boots, which was a fairly common Vibram lug. They were inside my track by about 50 yards, meaning they started beside mine, kept pace with mine for a stretch, and then stopped. They ended mid-stride. No scuff, no deeper press where someone might have turned. Just the right foot pressed down and nothing after. It bothered me, because boots leave compression in snow that takes a few hours to crystallize over. These prints were crisp, which meant they'd been laid down that morning. Nobody else was supposed to be in that corridor. It was private right-of-way, posted at both ends, and I'd have seen vehicle tracks on the service road if a hunter had cut across. There were none. I squatted next to the nearest print and looked at it closely. The tread was crisp the way a print is crisp when it's been laid in packed frozen crust rather than fresh powder. The heel had compressed normally. The toe had a small inward cant, not pronounced, the kind of cant that comes from a person who lists slightly to one side when they walk. I list slightly to one side when I walk. I had shoulder surgery in my early 30s and never fully got the rotation back. I've been told by every physical therapist I've seen since then that I favor my right a little. My boot prints show that cant. So did these. I stood up and looked at my own line of prints, the one I'd just laid down, coming up the corridor. Then I looked at the parallel line, then at the spot where the parallel lines stopped, about 50 yards behind me. They stopped mid-stride. Right foot down, no left following. The snow crust around where a left print should have been was undisturbed. I stopped. I called Luke. I said I had some prints parallel to mine that I couldn't account for. He asked if they were fresh. I said they were. He said he'd circle back to the last access gate and see if it had been opened. He was back on the radio in about 12 minutes. Gate was locked. Chain was intact. Padlock was company issued and hadn't been cut. He said the next gate north was 3 miles up and he hadn't passed anything on the road since he dropped me. I marked the coordinates and kept walking. The right thing to do when you find something you can't explain on a right-of-way is finish the survey, note everything, and file a supplemental report. You don't turn around. The pipe gets surveyed on a schedule, and the schedule exists because leaks on frozen ground don't announce themselves politely. Around the 3-mile marker, the sniffer chirped hot for the first time. I was crossing a dry wash, a shallow cut in the right-of-way where the ground dipped about 6 feet and then rose again on the far side. The pipe sat under the wash with a concrete saddle for lateral stability. I had checked it 2 surveys ago, and the saddle was sound. As I came up the far bank, the chirp went solid, and the digital readout on the sniffer jumped to 400 parts per million. 400 is not a crisis number. It's a number that gets you to pay attention. You're supposed to call it in at 100, walk the grid at 200, and start looking for above-ground sources at 400. I did all 3. I radioed Luke. He asked me to hold the grid so he could drive up to my position. He pulled onto the service road shoulder across from me and got out with his own meter, which was a backup unit he carried in the truck. He came across the right-of-way on foot and walked the dry wash slowly. His meter read the same as mine. 400, holding steady on that patch of ground, dropping back to background 20 feet on either side. There was no above-ground source, no leaking fitting, no breather vent, no scent of sulfur compound, no hissing, no vegetation discoloration. The readings were just sitting there in the air, over bare, frozen dirt. We marked the coordinates and waited. The readings didn't change. Luke photographed the ground. I photographed the meters. We moved 100 feet further north along the center line, and the readings dropped to 12 parts per million, which is ambient for that country in January. Standard protocol at that level of reading is a grid sweep. You walk a square pattern around the anomaly and record the boundaries of the elevated concentration, which gives engineering a footprint they can overlay on the pipe route. Luke helped me run the grid. We walked a 30-foot square, then a 60-foot square, then a 90-foot square, with the original anomaly at the center. The elevated reading was contained to a circle roughly 12 feet across. Outside that circle, it dropped to background. Inside it, it held at 380 to 400 parts per million, steady, not pulsing. I'd done this job for 11 years at that point, and I'd seen elevated methane in many configurations. You see it over an actual leak, which forms a plume that drifts downwind and disperses with height. You see it in low places where a natural seep occurs, which is a broader, shallower concentration. You see it in enclosed spaces like vault rooms and manholes, where it pools. You do not see it as a stable circle 12 feet across over open ground in a 10-degree wind. The wind should have blown it apart inside a minute. It wasn't blowing apart. Luke said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "We note it, photograph it, log coordinates, and continue." The anomaly wasn't a hazard to the pipe. It was a hazard to me, potentially, because I was standing in a concentrated methane pocket, but the concentration was well below the lower explosive limit, and there was no ignition source. I stepped out of the circle. I walked another 20 feet north. The readings dropped. I called it in to dispatch by radio. Dispatch noted it. Luke said he'd call the control center and let them know we had an unexplained concentration at that location. Control center was in Denver. They'd be able to pull SCADA data on the pipe's pressure history at that segment and confirm whether the pipe itself was showing a drop that would indicate a slow leak. Meanwhile, I'd keep walking, and he'd tail me in the truck as normal. He was in the cab for about 5 minutes on the phone. I walked on. My back was to the truck for that stretch, which ordinarily doesn't bother me, but I caught myself turning to check. I'd do that sometimes on longer surveys, look back to make sure the truck was still there. That day I did it more than usual. The wind had picked up, and there was a thin whine coming off the pinion that I hadn't noticed earlier. At 3.5 miles, I found the second set of prints. These were different. They started at the edge of the tree line on the east side of the right-of-way and came out toward the center line about 10 feet, then stopped. No return tracks. The prints were close together, with the toe pointed inward a fraction, the way a person stands when they're watching instead of walking. The tread was my tread, my size, fresh. I stopped. I didn't radio immediately. I looked at them for maybe half a minute, trying to decide whether I was looking at something I'd missed on the way in, which I hadn't, or something that was happening in parallel to me, which didn't make sense either. I called Luke. I described the prints. He said he'd seen no one on the road, and nothing had moved at the east gate. He asked if I wanted to stop the survey. I said, not yet. The sniffer was quiet. The pipe was pressurized and functional as far as the SCADA data would show. I told him to stay on my side of the right-of-way until I got to the next marker, and I kept walking, and he idled the truck alongside me. The third set of prints was on the service road. Luke saw them first. He radioed. He said there were prints on the shoulder, in the snow, coming out of the trees on the west side of the road, crossing the road and continuing east into the right-of-way. He said they weren't there on his pass inbound. He said the print pattern matched mine. I got to the service road and I looked at them. They were Vibrams. They were 11. They were my lug depth and my stride length. The snow on the service road shoulder had been pristine when Luke drove up. Now, it had a crossing line of boot prints in it, leading from the tree line west of the road directly into the corridor where I was walking. I asked Luke to run the driver's license photo I kept in my employment file. I didn't explain why. He opened the laptop on the passenger seat and pulled it up. I told him to compare my boot print pattern, because that pattern was visible in the new snow where I'd just stepped onto the road, to the boot print pattern that had crossed in front of him. He compared them. They matched. He asked what I wanted to do. I told him I was going to finish to the compressor station. It was 2 miles further north. I wasn't going to turn around, because turning around would put me walking back through everywhere those prints came from, and the prints were moving in my direction of travel. I'd rather go forward into a lit and occupied facility than retrace. Luke said he'd stay on my side of the road and keep the truck close. I walked. Somewhere past the 4-mile mark, the sniffer started chirping again, but in a pattern that wasn't right. A sniffer has a specific rhythm. Low chirp at background, faster chirp at elevated, solid tone at threshold. What I was hearing was low chirp with gaps in it, not steady. Not a dying battery either, because I'd swapped a fresh one at the truck. It was as if something in the ambient air was oscillating in and out of the detection range. I raised the unit. I lowered it. The chirp stayed the same. It wasn't the unit, it was the air. I've thought about that a lot since. The physical explanation for an oscillating methane reading in open air is a source that's cyclically releasing and stopping, which you'd see in something like a poorly seated valve chattering under pressure. There was no such source. The pipe was intact. The SCADA confirmed pressure was holding. What I was hearing was a gas signature in the ambient corridor air that was pulsing on some rhythm the instrument could register, but I couldn't identify. The chirp pattern was close to the rhythm of my breathing. I noticed that after about a minute of walking. I tried holding my breath for a stride or two. The chirp pattern didn't change. That was when I became aware of something in the tree line on the east side of the right-of-way. Not seen, not a silhouette. Just a sense of mass, the way you feel a large animal in the woods before you spot it, the way your body knows before your eyes do. I didn't look directly. I kept walking at pace. I had about 30 yards of clear ground between me and the tree line on that side, and the service road with Luke's truck about 50 yards on the other. I was in the center of an open corridor, the cleared right-of-way, and the only thing in it was me. I was wrong about that. The sniffer went solid. The needle climbed. 400. 600, 1,000. Then it dropped, all at once, like a valve had shut. I stopped walking. Luke's voice came over the radio and asked if I was okay. I said I was. He said he could see me from the truck. He said I looked like I was waiting for something. I said I was. Then I looked at the tree line on the east side. Something was standing there. It was about 50 feet back from the edge of the tree line, in the shadow between two old pinions, and it was the rough shape of a person, tall enough, shoulders narrow, arms too long by a hand's width at each end, or maybe that was the angle. I couldn't see a face. What I could see was that it was wearing a tan Carhartt jacket, same cut and same color as the one Luke was wearing in the truck, same beanie too, dark wool, pulled low. The jacket was what did it for me. Carhartts in that country are common. Half the men I've worked with on right-of-way crews over the last decade wear some version of tan duck canvas. That's not the detail. The detail was that the jacket had a specific mark on it, a spot high on the left shoulder where Luke had torn the fabric on a barbed wire fence the previous autumn and had sewn a patch over it with upholstery thread because he didn't want to buy a new jacket. The patch was uneven. You had to know where to look for it, but once you did, you couldn't miss it. The jacket on the figure in the tree line had a patch in exactly the same place, same shape, same uneven edge from 50 yards out. I didn't raise the radio. I didn't call Luke. I turned my head a quarter turn and looked at the truck on the service road. Luke was in the driver's seat, window cracked, Carhartt jacket, beanie. I looked back at the tree line. The figure was still there, not moving, not exactly watching, not exactly anything. I unclipped my radio with my right hand, keeping my left holding the sniffer, and I keyed the transmit button. I said, Luke. I said, describe what you're wearing right now. He said, tan Carhartt, navy beanie, gray flannel. Why? I said, describe your position. He said, I'm in the driver's seat of the truck, engine running. I'm watching you. Why? I said, there's something in the tree line on the east side wearing your jacket. There was a pause on the radio. Luke said, I'm coming across. I said, no, stay in the truck. I'm walking to you. I started walking. I kept the sniffer up. I kept the radio keyed open, which you're not supposed to do because it chews battery, but I wanted Luke to hear if anything happened. The needle on the sniffer was ticking up again. The chirp was odd, short, broken. I crossed 40 yards of the right-of-way at a steady pace, not fast enough to be running, not slow enough to be sauntering. I crossed the service road. I got to the passenger side of the truck. I opened the door. I climbed in. I shut the door. Luke was looking at me. Then he was looking past me, through the passenger window, at the tree line. The figure was gone. Luke said, tell me what you saw. I told him. He said, let me get you to the station. We drove. He didn't go fast, because the service road wouldn't allow it, but he didn't linger either. About a mile further north, we came around a shoulder, and the compressor station came into view across a rise, a set of low buildings, and the 8 big sodium lights on poles that stayed on day and night. Sodium lights throw an orange cast on the snow that makes everything look like a photograph developed wrong. I've always liked them. As we came up to the main gate, my radio chirped. Not the sniffer. The handheld. Luke's voice came through. It said, hey, you got eyes on me. I looked at Luke. Luke looked at me. Luke's mouth hadn't moved. His handheld was sitting in the center console. The talk light was off. I keyed my radio. I said, say again. The voice said, hey, you got eyes on me. Same voice. Luke's voice. The exact timbre, the small catch he had on the K sound in his last name. Luke unholstered his handheld and set it on the dash where we could both see it. He picked up the truck microphone and said, this is Chase 1, state station, who's on this channel. No one answered. He said it again. No answer. He picked up his handheld and keyed it. He said, this is Chase 1, radio check. Only his handheld transmitted. The voice we'd heard a minute earlier didn't come back. He drove the truck through the compressor station gate. The gate operator on shift came out of the guard shack, and we told him we needed to make a call to control center. He looked at both of us and didn't ask questions. Guard shack operators at compressor stations generally don't ask questions. They write things in logs and let other people decide what the questions are. We called control center. We reported the methane readings. We reported the unusual figure. We reported the radio anomaly. Control center asked if we were in immediate danger. We said we were at the station. They said to hold there until a company truck came out from the yard with a second inspector to finish the walk. The second inspector was a woman named Sharon who'd been with the company for about 15 years and had done the pipeline inspection school in Tulsa before she ever came to the field. She showed up about 2 hours later. She had the same gear I did. She asked what had happened. Luke and I told her the version without the figure, the version with the methane, the radio, the prints on the road. The part about the figure in the Carhartt I told her in the break room at the station, with the door shut, and she didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said her father had worked this segment 20 years ago. I asked if he'd seen anything. She said he'd quit 2 weeks short of his pension over something he'd seen, and he wouldn't say what, and he'd been dead 7 years and it went to his grave. Then she said he'd left a notebook in the attic that her mother found after the funeral. The notebook had a few pages near the back that described the segment I'd been walking. Her father had sketched boot prints that ended mid-stride, and he'd written a date above each sketch, and the dates formed a pattern. Every 4 to 6 years, in January or February, in that same corridor, between the dry wash and the compressor station. Her father had been one of the inspectors who filed a report and was told to move on. His notebook had the incident numbers he'd been given. The numbers were in a sequence that matched the file room's retention system. She'd gone looking for the reports and found that they'd all been pulled. She said she'd walk the rest of the segment alone. She said she'd be fine. I asked her why she wanted to walk it alone. She said she'd been waiting to for a long time. She said she wasn't going to find her father's answers, but she was going to walk the ground he hadn't been able to finish, and that was as much as she was going to get. She said I'd done enough, and that Luke had done enough, and that neither of us needed to see whatever we'd almost seen a second time. Luke drove me back to the yard in town. We didn't talk much. When we got to the parking lot, I got out and stood there and looked at my truck, which was parked exactly where I'd left it that morning. There were no prints around it, except mine and Luke's and the lot attendants. I drove home. I ate. I went to bed early. I slept like I was paying for it. The company filed an incident report. The report number was 9476-01. I read it 2 weeks later when my supervisor brought it to my desk for signature. It listed anomalous methane concentrations at 3 locations, an unexplained radio transmission on a private channel, and a visual encounter by the primary inspector with an unidentified individual in the right-of-way corridor. The report did not describe the Carhartt. That detail stayed between Luke and me. Control Center pulled the SCADA data for the pipe segment. There was no pressure loss. The pipe was sound. The methane readings we'd recorded were real. The sniffer had been calibrated correctly, and the instrument logs preserved them exactly as we'd called them in. There was no engineering explanation. The report marked the readings unexplained and closed the case. About a month later, a representative from the pipeline operator's risk office called me. He was polite. He said he'd read the report and had a few follow-up questions. He asked whether I'd felt I was in physical danger. I said I had. He asked whether I'd pursued the figure into the tree line. I said I hadn't. He seemed relieved by that, which I noted. He asked whether I'd be comfortable being reassigned to a different segment going forward. I said I'd prefer it. He thanked me and said he'd make sure that happened. He did not ask me what I thought the figure had been. I did not offer. I was reassigned the following quarter to a different segment in the south of the state that ran through ranch land without any forest. I asked for the change. My supervisor didn't ask why. I think he'd read Sharon's report on the following day's survey, which had ended at the south boundary of the corridor with a second unexplained methane concentration and no further incidents. Sharon had walked out on her own feet and driven home. She hadn't said what, if anything, she'd seen. I didn't ask. Luke transferred to a different chase route 6 months after the incident. He's still with the company. We get coffee sometimes. We don't talk about that morning. Sharon stayed on the segment for 2 more years. She told me once, over a beer at the yard Christmas party, that she'd walked the segment a total of 7 times after my incident and had not seen anything she couldn't explain. She said the readings had returned to normal. She said she'd looked at the tree line every time she passed it and it had been just a tree line. Then she said her father's notebook indicated the interval was 4 to 6 years and she'd be due for retirement by the next one. She raised her bottle when she said that. I raised mine back. We didn't clink them. What I took from it, and what I'll tell anyone who's going to work a right-of-way alone or with a chase driver in country where the corridors are cleared through timber, is this. The sniffer is the most honest piece of equipment you'll ever carry. It doesn't lie. If it alarms on bare ground where there's no pipe and no fitting and no source, don't assume the instrument is wrong. The instrument sees the air. The air is what's there. Trust the instrument and go toward the lights. Story 2. 47 head. 47 head of cattle, one night, one fenced pasture, and every wound on every animal sat in the same place on the left shoulder. The photographs are still sealed in the claim file under a fictitious incident number, and the rancher never said the word for what he thought did it. I'm not a law enforcement officer. I'm not a biologist. I'm a field claims adjuster for an agricultural insurance carrier based out of Albuquerque, which is to say, I drive a Ford Explorer around New Mexico and eastern Arizona, looking at dead livestock and figuring out whether the carrier owes the rancher money. Most of the claims I handle are mundane. Lightning strikes, lobo predation in the panhandle, blue-green algae in stock tanks, occasional rustling, which the FBI handles on tribal land and the state police handles everywhere else, and which I just document. I've been at it for 14 years. I keep a paper log alongside the digital file because I learned early that sometimes the digital copies get edited by somebody in the home office, and I don't care to be the only person holding on to the original numbers. The claim came in on a Thursday morning in October. My partner for that kind of thing was a photographer named Paul. Paul wasn't strictly a photographer. He was a claims documentation specialist, which meant he took pictures, held the tape measure, wrote down what I dictated, and otherwise did the paperwork while I did the interview. He was in his late 50s. He had retired from the state police and taken the job with the carrier because he didn't want to sit at home and because his wife said she'd divorce him if he retired and sat at home. Paul was steady. Paul had seen a lot of things in his first career. I liked working with Paul. The dispatch came through as a single line of text on our shared ticket system. Ranch loss, Navajo Nation, Window Rock area, 47 head, requesting adjuster immediately. The carrier's maximum single loss event payout without additional underwriting approval was on the order of $60,000. And 47 mature Angus cross cattle at current auction prices was right at the edge of that. The note added that the rancher had specifically requested an in-person visit before end of day. Most ranchers don't request that. Most ranchers want the adjuster to stay away as long as possible so they have time to get their story straight. When a rancher wants you there immediately, it's usually because he's scared. We left Albuquerque at 10 a.m. Paul drove. I handled the phone calls. The drive to the western side of the reservation took the better part of 4 hours. Along the way, I called the rancher twice to confirm directions. He answered both times. He spoke in short, clean sentences. His name was Mr. Begay. He gave me a set of landmarks to use once we got off the highway, because the GPS in that country is unreliable, and I'd learned a long time ago to get the hand-drawn version from the landowner whenever possible. He said there would be a mailbox with no name on it, a right turn onto a 2-track road, a cattle guard, then another mile, then his house on the left. He said he'd meet us at the cattle guard. On the drive, Paul asked me what I knew about the area. I said not much. I said I'd worked a couple of sheep claims near Chinle about 6 years earlier and one grass fire claim near Crown Point, but Window Rock was new territory for me. Paul said he'd worked it once when he was still with the state. He said he'd driven a prisoner back from a Navajo Nation police handoff and he'd stayed over one night in Gallup and hadn't thought about it since. I asked him what the prisoner had been held for. Paul said he didn't remember, and I let that go, because Paul remembered every prisoner he'd ever transported, and the thing he didn't remember was something he didn't want to talk about. That was his way. We stopped for lunch in Grants at a diner along the interstate. I had a green chili burger. Paul had a bowl of posole and drank too much coffee. We talked about work cases, the boring ones, the lightning strike in Deming from the previous summer, the fire out in the Bootheel, where we'd stood with a rancher who lost 80% of his herd to smoke inhalation and watched him try not to cry. That had been a bad one. Nothing about it had been supernatural. It had just been bad the way real life is bad, and those are the claims that stay with you longer than you think they will. I told Paul I thought about that rancher sometimes. Paul said he did too. He paid the check and got back on the road. We got there a little after 2 in the afternoon. The air was clear, elevation around 7,000 feet. There had been no rain in the preceding week. The cattle guard looked like every cattle guard I'd ever seen, a set of steel rails spanning a shallow pit where a vehicle could pass but a hoofed animal couldn't. Beyond the guard, the two-track wound up a gentle rise toward a single-story adobe house with a tin roof and a wind pump beside a water tank. The wind pump was turning slowly in a breeze I couldn't feel at ground level. Mr. Begay was waiting at the guard in a green ranch truck that had to be 20 years old. He was maybe 60. Silver hair under a black hat, blue work shirt. He did not get out of his truck when we pulled up. He waved us in past him, and we followed him up the two-track to the house. He parked. We parked. He got out and shook our hands. His grip was firm. His eyes were rimmed red, not from crying, but from not sleeping. He didn't offer us anything to drink. He didn't invite us inside. He walked us around the house to a gate in a 4-strand barbed wire fence and said the pasture was half a mile northwest. We'd be taking his truck. He said it in a way that wasn't a question. We got in his truck, Paul in the middle, me against the passenger window. Paul had his camera bag on his lap. Before he started the truck, Mr. Begay sat still for a moment with both hands on the wheel. He said he wanted to say one thing before we went up there. He said the carrier had asked him when he'd filed the claim what he thought had killed the cattle. He told them he didn't know. He said he was telling us the same. He said he didn't want us asking him what he thought it was. He said if we had questions about the pasture, the fence, the carcasses, the timeline, he would answer. If we had questions about what he thought did it, he would not answer, and we should not ask. He said he did not mean to be rude. He said he meant it was important that he not say the word. He said the word belonged to a different kind of knowledge than the kind that went in claim files. I said I understood. Paul said he understood too. Mr. Begay started the truck. On the drive up to the pasture, Mr. Begay didn't talk. He drove slowly, which didn't help, because the two-track was washboarded and the truck bounced anyway. We passed another wind pump and 2 stock tanks, both of them dry. Then we came over a low rise, and the pasture spread out in front of us. It was a big pasture, maybe 300 acres, fenced on all 4 sides, with 4-strand barbed wire. The grass was thin from a dry summer, but it was grass. There was a line of junipers along the north fence. The rest was open. The cattle were in the south half of the pasture. All of them. Down. I'd seen mass losses before. I'd seen lightning strikes that dropped a dozen at once. I'd seen a tornado in eastern New Mexico that killed 19 head in a single afternoon. I'd seen coyote packs and wolf incidents and one truly terrible case of poisoning from an irresponsibly dumped cleaner. Nothing I'd seen looked like that pasture. The cattle were scattered, not clumped. They hadn't run together. They had been dropped where they stood, distributed across an area of about 50 acres. They were on their sides, mostly, or on their knees with their heads down, as if they just knelt and then tipped over. Mr. Begay stopped the truck at the gate. He didn't get out. He said, "Go ahead and look." He said he'd be in the truck. Paul and I got out. Paul had his camera around his neck and a notepad in his breast pocket. I had my clipboard. We walked the fence line first, which is procedure. You don't enter the incident area until you've documented the perimeter. The fence was intact. 4 strands, no breaks, no cut wire. The gates were all closed. No prints around the gates except the rancher's truck tires. We went in. I stopped at the first carcass and knelt. Adult Angus cow, maybe 3 years old, healthy weight, good condition, no bloating, which meant she died within the last day or so. No scavenger damage either, which bothered me because coyotes and ravens should have been on her by then. I checked her body. Left shoulder. The wound was on her left shoulder. It was a puncture, not a tear, and it was clean. Single entry, about 3 inches deep. I probed it with a gloved finger. No broken bone beneath. The wound didn't match anything I knew. It wasn't a bite. It wasn't a claw. It was something that had punched into her with enough force to penetrate 3 inches of muscle and no more. I looked at her eyes. The eyes were open. The tongue was not protruding, which you'd expect in an animal that had struggled before death. Her legs were folded under her in a relaxed position. She had not gone down fighting. She had gone down like she was tired. I checked her nose and her mouth for foam or mucus. Nothing. I listened to her chest, which I don't know why I did because she was plainly dead, but I put my ear to her and heard nothing. I stood up and took a GPS coordinate on her and wrote her tag number in my notebook. Tag numbers were standard Navajo Nation brand inspection tags, a series of numbers and letters stamped into a plastic ear tag. I recorded everyone I saw that day, every tag, every position, every wound depth. I filled 3 pages of my notebook and started a 4th. Paul took pictures. I moved to the next carcass. Same wound, same shoulder, same depth. The 3rd, the 4th, the 5th, all the same. I stopped counting at a dozen. We spot checked across the pasture. Paul photographed every one. Every single animal had the same wound in the same location. 47 head. Everyone on the left shoulder. Everyone to the same depth. Everyone clean, no tear, no drag, no secondary trauma. Paul called me over to one of the carcasses near the center of the pasture. He pointed to the wound and said he'd noticed something. He said the edge of the puncture was smooth, like something had gone in at a single angle, and the ring of hair around the puncture had not been mussed. He said if you stab an animal, even cleanly, the hair gets pulled into the wound a little. The hair around this wound was perfectly flat. Paul said he'd seen enough knife wounds in his first career to know that wasn't how they looked. I asked him what else he'd seen that he'd noted. Paul said he'd noted that none of the animals had blood on the ground under their shoulders. Any puncture wound in a living animal bleeds, even a small one, and 47 penetrating wounds in a fenced pasture should have left 47 blood patches in the dirt. There weren't any. The wounds had been made, or the animals had died, in a way that didn't bleed. I stood there with my notebook out and didn't write that down, because I didn't want it in the claim file on paper. Paul didn't photograph the lack of blood. He just looked at me and we both understood we were going to move past it. I went back to the truck. Mr. Begay had not moved from the driver's seat. His window was down. I asked him what he thought had happened. He said he didn't know. I asked him if he'd seen or heard anything the previous night. He said he'd heard his dogs bark once, around midnight. Then they stopped. When he went out in the morning, they were both dead, laid side by side on the front porch, no wounds on either of them. He said he'd buried the dogs before we got there because he didn't want them photographed. I told him we weren't going to include his dogs in the claim unless he wanted us to. He said he didn't. I asked him if there was anyone else living on the property. He said his son. His son had been in the upstairs bedroom last night and had come down at first light and walked past Mr. Begay in the kitchen without a word and gone out to the pasture. Mr. Begay said he'd followed him out about 10 minutes later and found him standing in the middle of the pasture among the dead cattle. He said his son had been standing there for who knows how long, just standing. He had said something to his son, and his son had turned and looked at him, and Mr. Begay had stopped talking. I asked him what his son had done after that. He said his son had walked back to the house and gone upstairs and been in his room since. I asked him if his son would talk to me. Mr. Begay looked at me for a long beat. Then he said he'd ask him. Then he said, "Go, keep working." We kept working. Paul photographed every carcass from multiple angles. I walked the pasture, looking for tracks. I found nothing. No coyote, no mountain lion, no dog. No human except the rancher's boot prints near the gate and what I assumed were his son's boot prints scattered among the animals. I measured the son's boot prints because that's procedure. The prints came from the direction of the house. They walked out among the cattle. Then they stopped. Then they stopped. I want to say that clearly. The tracks didn't return. The son had walked out into the pasture and not walked back. His tracks went out. They did not come in. I walked the out tracks all the way to where they ended. They ended at a carcass near the center of the pasture. The son had stood beside that carcass for a while. The dirt around the carcass was scuffed where his feet had shifted, the way you shift when you've been standing in one place thinking about what you're looking at. Then the tracks stopped. No drag marks indicating he'd been picked up or carried. No second set of tracks joining his and leaving. He'd simply stopped making tracks. I looked at the carcass he'd been standing beside. It was a yearling bull. The wound on his left shoulder was identical to all the others. I took a photograph. I took another photograph from a different angle. I wrote his tag in my notebook. Then I turned and walked back to where the son's tracks had started, at the gate, and I followed them out to the carcass a second time, counting steps. 82 steps from the gate to the stopping point. I wrote that down too. I looked back toward the house. I could see it across the rise. I could see the upstairs window. The curtain in the upstairs window was drawn. There was no movement. I went back to Mr. Begay's truck. I asked him which direction his son had returned from the pasture. He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "His boot prints in the pasture only go out. There are no return prints." Mr. Begay went still in a way that I noticed. Not the still of a man who's confused. The still of a man who's just had something confirmed. He said maybe he walked back along the fence line. I said I had walked the fence line. There were no prints along the fence line. Mr. Begay said nothing for a long moment. Then he said maybe he came around the north side. He said he'd ask when he got back to the house. I asked Mr. Begay what his son had been wearing when he walked out into the pasture that morning. Mr. Begay didn't look at me when he answered. He said, "A black denim jacket, a trucker cap, tan work boots." Mr. Begay said his son had been wearing that outfit every day for about 6 months. He said his son didn't own much else. I wrote the description in my notebook. I didn't say anything else about it to Mr. Begay at that point. We kept working. Paul moved on to the south half of the pasture to photograph the last dozen carcasses. I stayed near the fence line to finish the perimeter check. The wind had picked up. The junipers on the north end were hissing, the way junipers do, in a breeze. I started hearing something else underneath the juniper noise. It took me a while to identify it. It was bawling. Cattle bawling, distressed, somewhere beyond the north fence. The sound of a cow that's calling for a calf. I knew that wasn't right. Mr. Begay's cattle were all dead in the pasture behind me. The neighboring property was 2 miles north, according to the topo I'd pulled before we drove out. Sound carries in that country, but not that clearly, and I hadn't heard the bawling when we first got out of the truck. It had started while I was walking the fence. I stopped and listened. The bawling was steady. It wasn't a single cow. It was 2 or 3, distressed. I couldn't tell the direction exactly. It was coming from past the junipers, from the flat open ground beyond the fence. I turned and looked at Paul. He was about 200 yards away from me, in the middle of the pasture, kneeling beside a carcass with his camera up. He hadn't stopped. He hadn't looked up. The sound was reaching me, but evidently not him. I walked over to Paul. I asked him if he could hear anything. He lowered his camera and listened. He said he couldn't hear anything. I said, "Listen more carefully." He listened. He shook his head. I said, "There's cattle bawling past the north fence." Paul looked toward the north fence. He said there aren't any cattle past the north fence. He said he'd already checked the topo. I said, "I know, but I'm hearing it." Paul took his camera and walked north with me, a little way. We got within 50 yards of the north fence. He stopped and listened. He said he still couldn't hear anything. I could hear it. It had gotten louder as I walked toward it. I looked through the junipers. I could see through to the other side. There was flat open ground past the fence, bunch grass, no cover, no cattle, no animals at all. The bawling was coming from somewhere in that flat, empty ground. I stopped walking. I listened for another 30 seconds, which felt a lot longer. The bawling had a quality to it I hadn't registered at first. It was rhythmic, but the rhythm was too even. Real distressed cattle have ragged breathing. They cough. They pause. These were vocalizations at fixed intervals, like something had learned the pattern of a bawling cow from a recording and was reproducing it without quite understanding what parts to vary. I thought about that for a second, and I stopped thinking about it, because thinking about it made it worse. I said we should go back. Paul said yes, we should. We walked back south toward the gate. I kept hearing the bawling all the way back. It didn't stop. It didn't get quieter or louder. It kept up at the same volume and the same tone, like a recording on a loop. At the truck, with the engine running and the doors closed, I couldn't hear it anymore. Mr. Begay had the radio on low. Country music. He was looking out the windshield at the pasture. I asked him if cattle ever wandered onto his land from the north. He said there were no cattle to the north. His neighbor ran sheep. I said I could hear cattle bawling past the north fence. Mr. Begay didn't ask me to clarify. He didn't ask me why. He looked at me in the rearview mirror and said, "Go tell your partner we're done for the day." He said we could come back tomorrow if we needed to. He said we had enough for the claim. He said we should get in our car and leave before sundown. I said we still had about an hour of daylight. Mr. Begay said, "Go tell your partner we're done for the day." He said it the same way. Not louder, not faster, just the same words again. Clean, the way you'd talk to somebody who wasn't listening. I went and got Paul. We put our gear in the truck. Mr. Begay drove us back to our vehicle at the cattle guard. He didn't speak on the drive down. At the cattle guard, he stopped. We got out. Paul shook his hand. I shook his hand. Mr. Begay got back in his truck and drove away. We loaded our vehicle. Paul was packing his camera bag when I looked up past the cattle guard on the far side, and I saw someone standing there. It was a young man, maybe 20, wearing a black denim jacket and a trucker cap. He was leaning on the far rail of the guard, looking at me. I recognized the jacket. I had photographed it in the pasture earlier. The jacket belonged to the son's boot prints, because the boot prints had come out of the house, and the son had been wearing that jacket when he walked out there, according to Mr. Begay's description, when I had asked what his son had on him that morning. The same jacket was now on this young man at the cattle guard. The young man didn't say anything. He didn't wave. He looked at me. I said to Paul, quietly, to finish loading. Paul said, "What?" I said, "Finish loading and get in the car." Paul finished loading. He got in the passenger seat. I walked around to the driver's side, got in, and started the engine. The young man was still at the cattle guard. He hadn't moved. I put the car in gear. I drove forward. The cattle guard was ahead of us. The young man was on the other side of it, standing on the far rail. I'd have to drive through where he was standing to get to the county road. I looked at him as I drove up. His face was wrong. I don't know how to say it better than that. The features were in the right places and they weren't moving wrong, but the angle of the cheekbones and the way the mouth sat weren't how human faces are made. The way you can tell a mannequin from a person even at a distance. That kind of wrong. I looked at him for about half a second as I rolled toward the guard, and I looked away because looking longer felt like a mistake. As I got within 20 feet of the cattle guard, he stepped back off the rail into the middle of the two-track on our side of it. He was now between us and the BIA road. Paul saw him then. Paul didn't say anything. Paul reached over and turned the high beams on. The young man's face came into the light. It was not Mr. Begay's son. It was not a person. It was a shape that knew what a person's face was supposed to look like and had gotten most of it right and had missed something fundamental. The eyes were too far to the sides. The mouth was closed and looked like it didn't open. The skin reflected the headlights in a way that I am not going to describe. The figure turned and walked off the two-track into the scrub to our left. Not quickly, not slowly, just a walk. It disappeared behind a small rise in the terrain about 30 yards off the track. Paul said, "Drive." I drove. I drove over the cattle guard and up the two-track to the BIA road. I turned right onto the pavement. I did not stop until we were on the main highway 10 minutes later, and I did not speak until Paul said something. Paul said, "Did you see the face?" I said, "Yes." Paul said, "I was a state trooper for 26 years, and I never saw anything like that." I said, "I haven't either." We drove to Gallup. Paul had called ahead to a motel. He got us both rooms. We ate dinner together in the motel restaurant. We didn't talk about what we'd seen. We talked about Paul's wife and my daughter, and the Yankees, who were in the playoffs that year. We went to our rooms. I slept poorly. Paul told me the next morning that he'd slept fine. I told him I didn't believe him. He said he didn't believe himself either. The next day we drove back to Albuquerque. I filed the claim with a supplemental incident report. The claim was paid in full, 47 head at fair market value, under a no-fault depredation clause in Mr. Begay's policy. The supplemental report was routed to the carrier's special cases desk, which is a small office staffed by one woman who handles the claims that don't fit the normal categories. She called me about a week later and asked me a set of questions in a careful order, and I answered them. She thanked me. She said the claim would be coded under an incident number reserved for what she called cryptid adjacent events, number 2883-11. She said the file would be sealed and would not be accessible through the normal claim lookup. She asked me if I was willing to continue working claims in that region. I said I was. She said thank you. She did not offer me the option to refuse. She also asked me one specific question that I remember, because it was worded carefully enough that she had clearly asked other adjusters the same thing. She asked whether, at any point during the site visit, the person who greeted us at the gate had been the same person in the same clothes when we left. I said he had been. She wrote that down. She did not tell me why she had asked. I did not press. I asked her once, near the end of the call, how many claims like this she handled in a year. She said, not many. She said more than the public would like to know about, but not many. She said the carrier had a specific reserve account for them. She said the account had been established in the 1970s and had never been empty. The file, to my knowledge, is still sealed. Mr. Begay filed one more claim with the carrier 2 years after that one. A smaller claim, forehead, conventional coyote predation, nothing unusual. I was not assigned. I don't know if he ever called about a larger loss after that. I drove through that part of the reservation in my personal vehicle about 3 years later, on a trip unrelated to work, and I took a long way around to avoid passing the cattle guard. I don't know whether Mr. Begay's son was upstairs that day when I first went out. I don't know if Mr. Begay ever got him back. Paul retired the following spring. He sends me Christmas cards. He never mentions the claim. Every year the card has the same pre-printed message and a handwritten line from his wife. The handwritten line does not mention me. Paul signs his name under hers. The signature is the only thing he writes, and it's legible, and that's how I know he's still thinking about me and probably still thinking about that pasture. A man who's forgotten you doesn't bother making his signature legible on a card his wife already wrote. If you're working livestock claims in country where the locals don't talk about certain things, and where the rancher greets you at the cattle guard instead of the house, and if you find yourself documenting wounds that are identical across every animal in a herd, don't stay past sundown. The wounds are not what killed the herd. They were something else. Whatever made them was practicing. Drive out before the light goes. Count your crew. Lock your doors at the motel and fill the claim out at the office in the morning. The claim will be paid. That is not the part that matters. Story 3, Fourth Night on the Tower. The senior lookout had one rule for after sunset. Don't answer the ladder, don't acknowledge the radio traffic from frequencies not on the board, and don't open the catwalk door for anything that sounds like a person. On my fourth night, something called up the ladder using his voice, and he was standing 3 feet behind me with his mouth closed. My name isn't important to the story. What's important is that I was 24 years old. I'd finished a forestry program 2 years prior. I'd spent 2 seasons as a trail crew laborer on the Gila, and I'd been pulled in the middle of June to a fire lookout orientation assignment because the scheduled trainee had cracked a collarbone falling off a pack mule on the approach ride. The senior lookout I'd be training under was a man named Wallace. Wallace had held that lookout for 15 fire seasons consecutive, and the Forest Service office in Silver City told me he was the only reason the position was still staffed at all, because the pay was bad and the isolation was worse, and most new hires quit inside 2 weeks. The tower sat on a peak at a little over 10,000 feet on the western side of the Gila Wilderness, about 9 miles by trail from the nearest road. The peak was named on the topo, but Wallace never called it by its name. He called it the tower or the box. The box sat on 4 steel legs, galvanized, with a 40-foot lift from the ground to the cab. The cab was about 14 feet square, glass on all 4 sides, with a wraparound catwalk outside the glass and a single trapdoor in the floor that opened onto the ladder. The ladder came up through a metal housing at ground level, and the housing had a hinged door that closed at the bottom. The cab was reached by climbing that ladder through the housing, up the shaft, and out through the trapdoor. From the catwalk you could see for about 60 miles in every direction on a clear day. I hiked in on a Wednesday. My pack had food for a week, my sleeping bag, a change of clothes, a headlamp, a pocket notebook, a paperback I'd been trying to finish for a month, and an issue radio. The Forest Service office had given me a laminated card with the radio frequencies used on the Gila, numbered in columns, with notes about which were administrative, which were for initial attack, which were for ground-to-air coordination, and which were reserved for the dispatch center. The card went in my left breast pocket. I also had a paper map of the district. The map went in my right pocket. I was young enough to think of the card and the map as backups to my phone, which would have signal for about the first mile of the hike and then nothing for the rest. I met Wallace at the base of the tower around 4 in the afternoon. He was in his early 60s, tall and thin, with a beard that had once been brown and had gone mostly gray. He wore jeans and a long-sleeve work shirt the color of dried grass and a beat-up wide-brim hat that he left on inside and outside. He was standing at the base of the ladder housing when I came up the trail. He did not come forward to greet me. He watched me cover the last 100 yards, and when I stopped in front of him, he nodded once and said he was glad I'd made it. He introduced himself. He told me he'd been expecting me 2 days earlier, but that the office had called on the district radio to let him know about the pack mule. He asked me if I'd ever been in a lookout tower before. I said I hadn't. He said that was fine. He said most people who had been in one before had certain expectations that made them worse trainees, and he preferred people who arrived with an open notebook. He asked if I had an open notebook. I showed him my pocket notebook. He nodded. He asked me where I'd grown up. I told him, a small town in the Florida Panhandle, and he said that was far from the Gila. I said I'd come west for college and stayed. He said most of the young lookouts he'd worked with had similar stories. People who wound up on the top of a mountain with a radio and a logbook tended not to have come straight out of the town they were born in. He said it took a certain amount of wandering before a person could sit still in the middle of the sky. He said that without a trace of poetry in his voice. He said it the way you'd describe the tolerance on a machined part. He asked if I had brought a book. I said I had. He asked what book. I told him. He nodded and said he'd never read it and wouldn't say it was any good or any bad. He said he didn't read books he hadn't already read. He said new books were a risk at the tower. He said his rule was that if he was going to spend a fire season with a book, he was going to spend it with a book he already knew he could handle. I asked him what he meant by handle. He didn't answer. He just pointed up at the cab and said we'd climb. He said we'd climb. He said the climb took about a minute and a half and I should take my time if I'd never done it. He opened the bottom of the ladder housing and gestured me in. I went up the ladder. I could hear him behind me, steady, not breathing hard. I came up through the trap door and set my pack down in the cab. The cab was cleaner than I had expected. A narrow bunk along the east wall, a propane range, and a small sink along the north. A compact radio set mounted above a map table along the south wall, beside the door that opened onto the catwalk. In the center of the cab, on a cabinet-height pedestal, sat the Osborne Firefinder, which is a circular map of the surrounding country with a sighting arm mounted on a pivot. You line up the sighting arm on a smoke, read the azimuth off the degree ring, read the distance off cross sightings from another lookout, and that gives you a position on the map. It's an instrument that was designed in the 1900s, and it has not been meaningfully improved on since. Wallace touched it lightly with the back of his knuckles when he came up through the trapdoor, the way you might touch a horse on the flank to let it know you were passing. I noticed that. I filed it away. Wallace made us coffee. We sat at the map table. He walked me through the duty cycle. First radio check at 6:45 a.m. every morning on the administrative channel, responding to the dispatcher in Silver City with the tower ID, the current weather, and any overnight observations. Second check at 10 a.m., third check at 2 p.m., fourth check at 6 p.m., closing check at 9 p.m. Between checks, you walk the catwalk at least once an hour during daylight. You scan with binoculars. If you see smoke, you take an azimuth on the Firefinder, you radio the bearing, you wait for another lookout to cross-reference, and you call in the position. If you see lightning, you mark it in the logbook with the time and bearing and estimated distance, because a strike you see today might not smolder into a visible smoke for 2 or 3 days, and the district wants the original strike locations in a file. He showed me the logbook. A green cloth-bound ledger, bound the old way, full of Wallace's handwriting going back several seasons. He showed me where previous lookouts had signed off on prior years, their names written in a list at the front. Some of the names had a small dot beside them. Wallace did not explain the dots. I didn't ask. We had dinner. He packed in staples and was working through them methodically. Beans and rice and a dry sausage that night. He drank tea. I drank tea because he offered it, and I didn't want to dig into my own supplies when he had some made. The sun set around 8:30. The cab got dim. Wallace lit a propane lantern and hung it from a hook in the center of the ceiling. The lantern threw a warm yellow light that didn't quite reach the corners of the cab. After dinner, Wallace sat across from me at the map table, and he said now we were going to go over the rules. He said these were not Forest Service rules. They were tower rules. They were specific to this tower. Other lookouts had their own rules, and he would not presume to know what they were because he'd only worked this one. He said I should write the rules down. I wrote, Rule 1. After sunset, do not answer the ladder. If someone calls up through the trap door, do not respond. If someone knocks on the ladder housing below, do not respond. Wallace said the Forest Service would never send anyone up after dark without radioing first on the administrative channel. Therefore, anyone calling up without radio contact was either a hiker who was lost, in which case they could wait until morning, or they were not a hiker. Either way, no response. Rule 2. Monitor only the frequencies listed on the laminated card. If voices come through on a frequency not on the card, ignore them. Do not respond. Do not acknowledge that you heard anything. Do not turn up the volume to try to make them out. Turn the volume down or turn the radio off. Wallace said frequencies in the spectrum can carry unexpected traffic from a long distance under certain atmospheric conditions. He said that was a technical explanation. He said the other explanation was that sometimes you heard things on the radio that weren't on any frequency he'd ever been able to identify, and that those transmissions tended to come through at night, and that responding to them was something he'd done once in the second season, and he didn't recommend it. Rule 3. Do not open the catwalk door after sunset for anything that sounds like a person. The catwalk door was the door that led from the inside of the cab out onto the exterior catwalk. The catwalk itself wrapped around all 4 sides of the tower. You would use it during daylight to get a better angle on a smoke or to scan without the glare of the cab glass. You would not use it at night. If a voice came from the catwalk asking you to open the door, you did not open the door. Wallace said there was a small deadbolt on the inside. He showed me. He said he engaged it every night at sunset and did not disengage it until sunrise. I asked him why these rules. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, because this is a tower on the Gila. He said that was as much answer as I was going to get from him that night. He said if I stayed through the season, and if I didn't break the rules, I'd understand on my own timetable. He finished his tea. He checked the radio. He made the 9 p.m. check. He listened for a minute after the check completed, and then he turned the volume down to a whisper. He said he'd sleep in the bunk on the east wall, and that I could sleep on a foam pad under the map table. He said he'd wake me for the 6:45 check. He said goodnight, and he took off his hat and set it on the shelf above the bunk, and he lay down and was asleep in under a minute. I did not sleep for a while. I lay there and looked up at the ceiling and listened to the pine branches moving in the wind outside. I could hear them through the glass. The cab creaked a little as the temperature dropped. Wallace slept without moving. After a while, I slept too. The first day was uneventful. Radio checks in order. No smokes. A thunderstorm passed to the south, and I watched it with binoculars, calling lightning strikes to Wallace, who entered them in the logbook. He let me take the 2 p.m. and 6 p.m. checks. I did them badly at first and adequately by the end. He made no comment on the difference. At sunset, he walked the catwalk, came inside, engaged the deadbolt on the catwalk door, and sat at the map table. We ate. We turned the lantern on. We did the 9 p.m. check. The second day was the same as the first, except that I had gotten better at the checks and Wallace had started letting me handle the azimuths on the firefinder when we practiced on imaginary smokes. I ran the morning checks. I walked the catwalk. In the afternoon, I noticed boot prints in the soft dirt at the base of the ladder housing. I asked Wallace about them. He came down the ladder with me and looked at them. They weren't his, they weren't mine. He said sometimes hunters came through. He said he'd seen it before. He did not seem surprised. He did not seem unsurprised either. He said we would leave them alone and go back up. I asked him if he was going to report it. He said no. He said hunters weren't against the law on that part of the Gila in that season, and a hunter who'd found a tower and left without doing anything wrong wasn't something you called in. I accepted that. We climbed back up. He took off his hat, hung it on the shelf, and ran the afternoon check. That night the radio caught something. It was about 10:30 p.m. We were reading. Wallace had a paperback of his own, some hard-boiled novel that he read pages of very slowly and then put down to think. I was on the second chapter of my own book. The lantern was at low. The radio was at a whisper, tuned to the administrative channel. Voices started coming through on a frequency that wasn't administrative. I couldn't tell what they were saying at first. The voices were a long way off, or sounded like they were. They were male voices, at least two of them, and they were having what sounded like a conversation. The tone was calm. There was no distress in it. I started to turn the volume up to hear better. Wallace put his hand on my wrist. He didn't look at me. He was still looking at his book. He said, "Don't turn it up. Turn it off." I turned the radio off. The voices stopped when the radio went off, obviously, because the radio was what was making them audible. What I noticed, and what stayed with me, was that the conversation had not sounded like an emergency. It had sounded like two men on a job discussing something logistical. I started to ask Wallace about it. He said not tonight. He said tomorrow in the daylight if I still wanted to know. He turned the radio back on about an hour later and checked the administrative channel for the closing check. The off-frequency voices did not come back. I slept poorly. I dreamed of voices. When I woke at 6 in the morning, Wallace was already on the catwalk with a cup of tea, watching the east horizon turn pink. The third day I asked him about the voices. He said he'd heard them off and on for the last 11 seasons. He said they came and went. He said he had tried his second season to identify the frequency they were using, and he had not been able to. He said it wasn't on the Forest Service bands. It wasn't on the amateur bands. It wasn't on a commercial band. He said a radio tech from the regional office had come up in his fourth season and had swept the spectrum with better equipment than Wallace had, and the tech had not been able to find the frequency either. The tech had not recorded the voices. Wallace said by the time the tech was set up, the voices had stopped. He said they usually stopped around the time anyone was paying close attention. He said that was part of what they were. I asked him what they were. He said he didn't know. He said if I stayed at the tower for 12 seasons, I'd have a guess. He said it wouldn't be a conclusion. He said he didn't deal in conclusions up there. That afternoon I found a second set of boot prints at the base of the ladder housing. I didn't tell Wallace immediately. I wanted to look at them first. These prints were different from the ones from the day before. They were larger, about a size 13, and the tread was a military pattern, the kind I'd seen on surplus combat boots. The stride was long. The prints came from the east side of the peak, walked up to the ladder housing, circled it once, and walked away to the west. Not back east. West. I followed them for about 20 yards to the west before they thinned out in the rocky scree and disappeared. I went back up. I told Wallace. He asked me to describe them. I did. He said he'd seen those before too. I asked him whose they were. He said he didn't know whose they were. He said they showed up about once a year toward the middle of the season. He said they always walked the same pattern. East to the tower, one circle, west away. He said he'd photographed them twice and sent the photographs to the district office, and the district office had not replied. That night was our fourth night together. Wallace walked the catwalk at sunset. He engaged the deadbolt on the catwalk door. He sat at the map table. I made dinner. We ate. We turned the lantern on. He ran the 9 p.m. check, and it went clean. He turned the radio volume down. Around 10:15 something called up the ladder. I heard it before Wallace did. I was sitting closer to the trapdoor. The trapdoor itself was closed, a square wooden panel flush with the floor, with a pull ring on top. Below the trapdoor, about 40 feet down, was the bottom of the ladder housing, which Wallace kept chained shut on the outside with a padlock that he locked at sunset. The voice came up through the trapdoor. It said the tower identifier, the three-letter code Wallace used on the administrative channel. It said it the way Wallace said it, quiet, low in the throat. Then it said, "Hello up there." I froze. I looked at Wallace. Wallace was sitting at the map table with his paperback open in his hands. He had looked up at the trapdoor when the voice came through. He had not moved otherwise. His mouth was closed. His mouth stayed closed. The voice called up again. It said it wanted to know if the trainee was awake. It said the words, "trainee awake," in Wallace's exact cadence. It knew how Wallace spoke. It knew the small pause he placed between trainee and awake. It knew the downward tilt at the end of a sentence that wasn't really a question. Wallace set his paperback down, silently. He put his finger to his lips. He did not speak. The voice called up a third time. This time it said my name. It used Wallace's voice. It said my name once, in the tone Wallace had used during dinner when he'd asked me to pass him the salt. I did not answer. Wallace was watching me. His eyes were steady. His mouth did not open. I stayed in my seat. I did not look at the trapdoor. I made myself look at Wallace. Wallace made himself into a still point for me to look at. That was what he was doing with his body. I understood it while it was happening. The voice called up 6 more times over the next 40 minutes, using variations on those phrases. Sometimes it sounded patient. Sometimes it sounded confused, as if it were wondering why we weren't answering. Once it laughed. The laugh was Wallace's laugh, which I had heard once that day, when he'd caught himself spilling tea. The laugh came through the trapdoor and was the exact same laugh I'd heard at the map table. Then the voice went quiet. Then it moved. I heard it on the ladder. It came up the ladder, not the footsteps of a person climbing, something else. A scrape along the rungs, like something was pulling itself up by its hands and dragging something else behind it. The scrape came up the shaft. It stopped just below the trapdoor. Wallace stood up, slowly. He walked to the propane range and turned the range off, which it hadn't been on, but he wanted something to do with his hands. Then he walked back to the map table and he sat down. He picked up his paperback. He turned a page. The trapdoor creaked. I looked at it. The wood flexed upward a little, the way a plank flexes when something is pressing on it from below. The pull ring on top did not move. The trapdoor did not open. It was designed to open upward from the top side, and it was weighted that way. Something below was pressing up against it with enough force to flex the wood a quarter inch, but without a handle on the bottom it could not lift the door. I looked at Wallace. Wallace turned another page. This continued for about 2 minutes. The trapdoor flexed and relaxed. Then something on the other side made a noise that was the sound of somebody sighing. Wallace's sigh. The exact timbre. The way the breath catches in the chest. Then the scraping went back down the ladder. Then it was quiet. Wallace set his paper back down. He said we would not open the trapdoor until sunrise. He said we would not go on the catwalk until sunrise. He said we would sit here, and we would not speak loudly, and we would run the radio checks from the map table with the radio at a whisper. He said he would take the early hours, and I could sleep if I wanted, and he would wake me for the 6:45. I did not sleep. Neither did he. At about 1:30 in the morning, the radio whispered. Something was on a frequency, not on the card. A single voice, male, at a low volume. It said it could hear us. It said we didn't have to stay quiet. It used the tower identifier. It used Wallace's name. Wallace reached over and turned the radio off at the wall switch, not at the volume knob. I understood why. He was not going to let anything come through that radio until the sun was up. At about 3 in the morning, while Wallace was sitting beside the map table with his hands folded in his lap, something on the catwalk outside at the east corner tapped the glass 3 times. A light tap. Like a finger. Wallace did not move. I did not move. The taps did not repeat. At about 4:30 the entire cab got colder. Not a little. Enough that I could see my breath. The propane lantern was still on. The range was not running. It never was at night. But the change in temperature had nothing to do with our heat sources. It was coming from outside. Or from below. I looked at Wallace, and he gave me the smallest shake of his head. Not to speak. Not to ask. I kept still. The cold stayed for about 15 minutes, and then it lifted, the way a cold draft lifts when a door closes somewhere. At dawn, the glass was unmarked. Wallace opened the deadbolt on the catwalk door, walked the 4 sides, and came back inside. He told me he'd found nothing on the catwalk. He told me he'd gone down the ladder. The ladder housing was chained and padlocked exactly as he'd left it at sunset. The boot prints at the base of the tower were not new. We ran the 6:45 check. We reported clean. Wallace walked me through the morning duty cycle and did not mention the night. At 11 a.m. he sat me down at the map table and said I had a choice. I could finish the 2 weeks of orientation with him and then take an assignment at a different lookout in the district, because he would not recommend placing a first-year trainee at his tower. Or I could leave that day, hike out, and take another position with the trail crew for the rest of the season. He said either was acceptable to him. He said the office would not penalize me either way. He said he had told the office a long time ago that any trainee who wanted to leave his tower after the first week should be allowed to leave without questions. I asked him if the voice had ever gotten in. He said once. He said he wouldn't tell me the year. He said the previous lookout, whose name had a dot next to it in the logbook, had opened the trapdoor on his 4th night in his 4th season. Wallace said he'd been the one to find what was left of him when he'd come up to relieve him. He said the dot in the logbook was a marker he kept, so he'd remember the lookouts who'd broken the rules. He said there were 4 dots in his logbook. He said he kept them to remind himself to keep writing the rules down for the trainees. He told me one more thing before we closed that conversation. He said the voice up the ladder, the one I had heard using his cadence, had been easier to resist than it would have been on my 2nd night. By the 4th night I'd had 3 days of knowing him, of hearing his voice in normal conversation, of being able to cross-reference. If the voice had come up the ladder on my 1st night, before I'd spent 4 afternoons with him at the map table, I would have been more likely to answer. I'd have been more likely to call back the way you call back to somebody you've met, but don't know well, the way you fill silence with your voice to be polite. He said the 4th night was the pattern. He said the thing wouldn't call up until it had heard a voice enough times to reproduce it. He said the boot prints at the base of the tower were how it got close enough to listen. He said he'd never seen anything make the boot prints. He said he didn't need to. I finished the 2 weeks. I took a posting at a lookout on the opposite corner of the Gila for the rest of the season. That lookout did not have the same rules. That lookout had different rules. I followed those too. I did not go back to Wallace's tower. Wallace retired at the end of his 17th season, 2 years after I trained with him. The office could not fill the position. The tower has been dark for 9 summers. The Forest Service has proposed decommissioning it 3 times and has not done so because the lookout infrastructure has historical protection status. The trapdoor is still in place. The ladder housing is still padlocked. A maintenance crew goes up once a year to check the glass and the generator. They go up in pairs. They go up in the morning. They are down by noon. I filed a sealed statement with the district office at the end of my 1st season describing the 4th night. The statement is, in a cabinet in the Silver City office, under an incident number 1142-19. I have not asked to see it since. I don't know if anyone else has. The woman who took my statement said the district keeps those files under a category labeled Unexplained Observations by Fire Personnel, and that the category dated back to the 1890s, and that most of the files in it were from specific lookouts that had been retired or rebuilt over the decades. She said Wallace's tower had a thicker folder than most. She did not let me read the rest of the folder. She said the files were not for lookouts to read. I understood what she meant by that. If you take a posting at a tower that has a senior lookout with a set of rules he teaches you on your 1st night, write the rules down. Carry them in your pocket. Read them before sunset every day of your posting. The rules are not superstition. The rules are the names of 4 people who did not follow them. The ladder is the boundary. Do not answer through a closed door. Not on your 4th night, not on any night. Story 4. 3 bearings. My partner radioed in from the north fence, then from the south, then from the east. Same voice, 3 bearings inside 2 minutes, and his truck hadn't moved from the pad lights the whole time. I've worked flowback in the Permian Basin for 11 years. If you don't know the job, the short version is this. After a well gets fractured, which is a crew of its own, somebody has to sit on the pad for the first week or 2 and watch what comes back out of the well bore. Water, sand, gas, whatever fluids were pumped in. You bleed the well down through a choke, you separate the phases, you route the gas to a flare stack, you measure the sand coming back in a trap, and you log pressure readings every 15 minutes. The job sounds easy on paper. What makes it hard is the hours. The work demands you stay awake for 12 hours straight while almost nothing happens, because the one time something does happen, if you aren't awake for it, the pad becomes a fire or somebody gets killed. You learn to drink coffee slowly. You learn not to eat heavy food on shift. You learn to stand up every half hour and walk around your truck so your back doesn't lock up. I was on a 2-man night shift out on a pad about 40 miles south of Pecos, Texas in late January. The pad was one of the quieter ones on our contract. An operator had drilled 4 wells on it that fall, completed them in sequence, and now we were into the 2nd week of flowback on the last of the 4. The flow rate was steady. The sand was tapering off. The well was behaving. It had been an uneventful week, and I'd been telling my partner that we'd probably be handed off to a different crew by Sunday, because the operator was going to start tying it into the gathering line, and we weren't needed for that part. The drive to the pad from Pecos took about an hour on a combination of highway and then caliche roads that got progressively worse the farther you got from town. The last 15 miles were 1-lane ruts through mesquite and creosote flats, with cattle guards every so often where the pad was cut into an active grazing lease. I'd made that drive 100 times. It was the kind of drive where you didn't pass another vehicle for 20 minutes at a stretch. At night you ran your high beams the whole way, and you watched for the eye shine of mule deer or the occasional javelina, which would damage a truck if you hit one wrong. That night I'd seen nothing on the drive-in. No deer, no javelina, no coyote crossing the road. The roadside had been empty. I noted it to Dale when I got to the pad. He said he'd seen nothing, either on his drive-in. We didn't think anything of it at the time. Slow wildlife nights happen in that country. My partner's name was Dale. Dale was 46, had 2 kids in high school, lived in Odessa, drove a Ford F-250 with a camper shell and a dog he couldn't bring to the pad. Dale and I had worked together on and off for about 6 years. Dale was a steady hand. He did the work the same way every shift. He showed up 15 minutes early for every relief. He brought his own coffee from home because he didn't trust gas station coffee at 3 a.m., and I had started bringing my own too because he was right. Dale carried a handheld radio on his belt, even though we were 50 feet apart on the pad, because that was how he'd been trained, and he wasn't going to stop doing it. The pad was a standard design, a rectangle of compacted caliche, about the size of a football field, surrounded by a chain-link fence, with 3 gates. At each corner of the pad stood a light tower, one of those diesel-driven units that held up 4 metal halide lights on an extendable mast. The 4 towers together threw enough white light across the pad to read a newspaper at midnight. On the west side of the pad, the 4 wellheads stood in a row, with their chokes and sample points and pressure gauges. Running east from the wellheads, a network of steel piping carried the flow to the separator, the sand trap, the storage tanks, and finally to the flare stack, which stood at the east end of the pad, on its own concrete pad. The flare stack burned off whatever gas came back, and the flame threw an orange light at the sky that you could see for miles. It hummed constantly. You got used to the hum. It was the sound of the whole pad working. Dale's truck was parked at the northwest corner, near the wellheads. My truck was parked at the southeast corner, near the flare stack. That gave us line of sight across the whole pad and let us split the work. Dale ran the wellhead readings. I ran the separator and sand trap. We traded every few hours to keep both of us from getting too cold in one position. We had our shift logs on clipboards in our trucks. We had the pressure charts pinned up on the dash with magnets because the wind in that country could pull a piece of paper off the clipboard in 3 seconds flat. That night was cold. 28 degrees at the start of the shift, wind out of the north at about 15 miles an hour. I had on my insulated coveralls, a wool watch cap, leather gloves with liners, and steel-toed boots. Dale had the same. We both had fire-retardant outerwear because company policy required it on an active flowback pad, and we wore the retardant gear, whether the flare was running hot or not. The flare was running at a steady medium that night. The storage tanks were holding. Pressure at the wellhead was 1,200 pounds per square inch, which was exactly where it had been for the previous 36 hours. I logged those numbers at the top of my clipboard and underlined them, which was a habit I'd picked up from a crew chief years ago. The first stable numbers of the shift are the baseline. If anything drifts later, you compare it to the first numbers. I underlined the 1,200 psi. I wrote the wind speed. I wrote the temperature. I wrote the time. The shift started at 6 p.m. First radio check-in with dispatch at 6:15. Dispatch was a woman named Linda who worked out of the service company's office in Midland and ran the night desk. Linda had been with the company for 20 years, ran a tight ship, and didn't tolerate nonsense on the channel. She liked Dale because Dale called in exactly when he was supposed to and didn't chat. She tolerated me because I did the same. Linda called each crew on her roster once an hour on the hour for the first 4 hours of the shift, and then every 2 hours after that, the calls were short. Crew identifier, position number, status, anomalies. If you didn't answer 3 calls in a row, Linda sent someone out. In 11 years, I had never missed a call. The first few hours of the shift were the way they always were. I walked to the separator, took my readings, walked to the sand trap, took those readings, walked to the storage tanks, checked the level sensors, walked back to my truck, logged the numbers on my clipboard. Dale did the same on his side. We met at the middle of the pad every 2 hours for a cigarette break, although Dale had quit smoking a year ago and drank coffee while I smoked, and we walked back to our respective sides. The radio was quiet. A couple of other flowback crews on the operator's other pads checked in on the shared channel. The operator's company man was asleep in his trailer on the south end of the pad. We'd probably wake him up once during the night, if at all. Around 9 p.m., Dale brought me a sandwich from his cooler. He'd made extra. He did that sometimes. His wife packed him more food than he could eat. That night it was turkey on wheat with mustard and a dill pickle on the side. I ate it at the tailgate of my truck while Dale stood next to me and we talked about nothing in particular. His older kid was applying to a community college. His wife wanted him to cut back on night shifts. He was thinking about it. Not seriously, he said, but thinking. I told him my own situation. My girlfriend wanted me home on weekends. I'd been working weekends for 11 years. I said I didn't know how to tell her that wasn't going to change. Dale said I should figure it out. He said the job would still be there. He said the girlfriend might not be. He was right. I knew he was right. I didn't say anything. He finished his coffee. He checked his watch. He said he was going to do his 9:15 readings. I said I'd do mine. We walked back to opposite ends of the pad. At 9:45 I heard an owl, great horned owl, calling from the mesquite somewhere off the west fence. It called 3 times in a rhythm, paused, called 3 more times. I liked owls. I stopped walking and listened. The owl didn't call again. That was the last natural sound I registered before the silence at 10. Around 10 p.m. I noticed the coyotes had stopped. There were 2 packs of coyotes within earshot of the pad. The nearer pack ran on a mesa about a mile to the east, and they usually called right after sunset and again around midnight. The farther pack was somewhere northwest at a greater distance, and we mostly heard them answering the first pack. Both packs had been vocal most nights that week. That night they'd been going at each other off and on since about 7. They went quiet around 10. That wasn't unusual by itself. Coyotes go quiet for a lot of reasons. A bigger predator moves through, a deer moves through, a truck passes on a county road, or they just stop. What was unusual was that they went completely silent, both packs, at the same time, and stayed silent. I noticed because I'd been half listening to them while I took my readings at the sand trap. They'd been there, and then they weren't. I stood at the trap and listened for about 2 minutes. Nothing. Not a yip, not a howl, not even the high crackle of the farther pack. The only sounds on the pad were the flare stack humming and the light tower's diesel motors running. I walked back to my truck. I radioed Dale on our pad channel, not the dispatch channel. I said the coyotes have stopped. Dale said, "Copy." He said he'd noticed. I said, "Anything on your side of the pad?" Dale said negative. He said all readings nominal. He said he was going to do a perimeter walk after his 11 o'clock readings, which was routine. We did perimeter walks twice a shift to check the fence line and the light towers. He said he'd radio if anything was off. I said, "Roger." I took my 11 p.m. readings. Everything was normal. I noted the coyote silence on my log because I like to log anything unusual, even if it turned out to be nothing. I saw Dale walking the north fence from my truck. His high visibility stripes caught the floodlights. He paused at the northwest light tower and shined his handheld on something at the base. Then he kept walking. At 11:15, the radio spoke in my cab. Dale's voice. Clear, close range, the way a handheld sounds when it's within a mile. He said he was on the north fence and had something he wanted me to see. I said, "Copy. What is it?" He said he wasn't sure. He said it looked like tracks, but the pattern was off. He said, "Come when I had a minute." I said I'd come after my 11:15 readings. I had to walk the separator, which would take me about 5 minutes. He said, "Copy. No rush." I did my readings. I logged them. I walked to the north fence. I got there at about 11:22. Dale was not at the north fence. The fence was empty. I keyed my radio. I said, "Where are you?" There was a pause. Then Dale's voice said he was at the south fence. He said he'd walked down there to check a tower he'd seen a flicker on. I said, "Copy. I'll meet you there." I started walking south across the pad. The pad was about 300 feet long on its long axis, and I was walking from the north fence toward the south fence, which meant I was walking past the wellheads, past the separator, past the storage tanks, past the flare stack. The flare stack was still humming on my left. The floodlights threw sharp shadows across the caliche from the various pieces of equipment. I got to the south fence at about 11:26. Dale was not at the south fence either. I keyed the radio. I said, "Dale, where the hell are you?" A pause, longer this time, maybe 20 seconds. Then his voice said he was on the east fence, by the flare stack access gate. He said his watch said 11:26, and he'd been there for about 5 minutes checking the lock on the gate. He said the lock looked fine, but he wanted my second opinion because it was the lock I'd installed last week. That last part stopped me. I had installed a lock on the east access gate the previous week. That was factually correct. The previous lock had been bent during a delivery, and I'd swapped it out for a padlock I kept in my truck toolbox. Dale had been watching me do it. He had been standing next to me when I'd done it, so he would know, but my watch said 11:27, and the first call from the north fence had come at 11:15. That was 12 minutes earlier. Dale could not have walked from the north fence to the south fence to the east fence in 12 minutes, because the north fence was 300 feet from the south fence, and the east fence was another 200 feet from the south fence, and all 3 walks required going around equipment. He would have been running, at minimum. I had been on the pad the whole time. I had not seen him run. I keyed the radio. I said, "Dale, say again your last." His voice came back, same cadence, same tone. He said he was at the east fence, east access gate, checking the lock. He said, "Come over." I said, "Stand by." I did not stand by. I did not walk east. I walked north. I walked back the way I'd come. across the pad toward the wellheads, because Dale's truck was at the northwest corner of the pad near the wellheads, and I wanted to see if his truck was still there. It was. Dale's Ford F-250 was parked at the northwest corner, exactly where he'd parked it at the start of shift. The engine was not running. The driver's seat was visible through the windshield under the floodlights. Dale was sitting in the driver's seat. His hands were on the steering wheel. He was not moving. I stopped walking about 30 feet from his truck. I keyed my radio. I said, "Dale." Dale's voice came through the radio. He said, "Yeah." I said, "Where are you right now?" Dale's voice said he was at the east fence, at the flare stack. He said he'd told me twice. I said, "I'm looking at your truck. You're in the driver's seat." There was a pause, longer than the others. Then Dale's voice said, "Copy." He said, "That was interesting." I stood there. I looked at Dale's truck. Dale, sitting in his driver's seat, was looking at me through the windshield. His hands were still on the steering wheel. He did not move. I keyed my radio again. I said, "Dale, step out of the truck." The Dale in the driver's seat opened the door and stepped out. He stepped out slowly, the way he did everything. He closed the door behind him. He kept both hands visible. He walked around the hood of the truck and stood in the pool of light under the northwest tower. He was about 20 feet from me. I looked at him. It was Dale. His face, his coveralls, his beard, his walk. Dale. I keyed my radio and said, "Say my name." Dale, standing in the light, said my name. His voice came through the radio a half second behind his mouth. I looked at his hand. The hand held on his belt was off. The light was dark. The channel indicator was dead. He had not keyed it. The voice on my radio said my name. I looked at Dale. Dale had said my name with his mouth. I had heard him with my ears at a distance of 20 feet. Then, a half second later, the radio had said my name in his voice, from a transmitter somewhere on the pad that was not his handheld. I looked at the flare stack. The orange flame was flickering in the normal way. I looked at the east fence by the flare stack access gate, which is where the voice had claimed Dale was. I could see that stretch of fence from my position. It was empty. There was nothing at the gate. No figure, no truck, no movement. I looked at the trailer to the south. The trailer was dark. The porch light was off. The windows were black. The trailer was empty, which I now knew, although at that moment I still thought Gary might be inside. I looked back at Dale. Dale and I looked at each other. Dale's face was showing nothing. Dale was a steady hand. I could see him running the same calculation I was running. He walked toward me. He kept his hands out. He stopped about 6 feet away. He said in a low voice that he'd been at his truck the whole time. He said he'd come back to the truck about 10:30 after his first perimeter walk. He said he'd been drinking coffee and running log entries and had not moved. He said he hadn't called me on the radio since about 10 o'clock. He said whatever had been calling me on the pad channel, it had not been him. I said I'd walk the fences, north, south, east. Dale said he knew. He said he'd been watching me from his truck. He said he'd wondered why I was walking perimeter when I didn't have a perimeter walk scheduled. He said he'd been about to call me on the radio to ask. I said, "What do we do?" Dale said, "We get in one truck." He said we stay together. He said we finish the shift or we call it and hand off to the operator's company man. He said either way, we don't split up. I said, "Copy." We walked to my truck because it was closer. We got in. Dale took the passenger side. I locked the doors. Dale turned his handheld off completely, not just muted, turned it off. I turned mine off too. We left the truck radio on the dispatch channel, which was a different unit with better range and better filtering. At 11:40, Linda called in from Midland. She said my crew ID and asked for a status. I said, "All readings nominal." I said, "We had a situation on the pad that I wanted to flag." I said, "I did not want to go into it on the channel." I said, "Could she put a call in to the operator's company man to come to the pad?" Linda said, "Copy. Stand by." She came back 4 minutes later. She said the company man was on his way. She said he'd be at the pad in about 20 minutes because his trailer was actually about 8 miles away on another pad and he'd driven over there at sundown. Dale looked at me. I looked at him. If the company man wasn't in the trailer, then nobody was in the trailer on our pad. We'd been on the pad alone all night. We looked at the trailer. The trailer was at the south end of the pad, about 200 feet away. The windows of the trailer were dark. The porch light was off. It had been off all night. I turned the headlights of my truck toward the trailer. The high beams threw light all the way across the pad. The trailer looked normal. The door was closed. No vehicles near it. No movement. We sat in my truck with the engine running for 19 minutes. I logged the readings from my truck window because I didn't want to get out. Dale took over the logbook so I could keep my eyes on the trailer and on the fence lines. The flare stack kept humming. The light towers kept their diesel motors running. The pad looked normal. The company man's truck came up the access road at 11:59. A white Chevy Silverado, dust kicking up behind it. He pulled through the main gate, which I had locked earlier in the evening, but which could be opened from a keypad, and he drove to the middle of the pad and stopped. I drove my truck up to his. Dale stayed in the passenger seat. We rolled down our windows. The company man was a man named Gary. Gary was maybe 50, heavy-set, a good company man. He'd worked the operators' pads in the Permian for 15 years. He looked tired. He'd been asleep. I didn't care. His breath fogged in the cold. I told him what had happened. I left out the face of the north fence because I wasn't sure I'd seen one. I told him about the 3 radio calls, the voice, the disagreement about Dale's position, and the fact that his trailer was empty. Gary listened. He did not interrupt. When I was done, he said he was going to call it in to the operator's head of operations and have us relieved. He said we could finish the shift in our trucks with our radios on, and he would stay on the pad with us until the relief crew got there. He said he did not want us to get out of our trucks for any reason until then. He said the relief crew would be at least 2 hours out because they were on another pad. He said one more thing. He said he'd had this happen one other time about 6 years earlier on a different pad about 50 miles west of here. He said on that night the entire flowback crew had reported multiple voices on their pad channel, and when the relief crew got there, 2 members of the original crew were missing. He said they were found the following afternoon in the desert about 3 miles from the pad, sitting on a rock, not injured, not able to say how they'd gotten there. He said they'd both quit the company the next day. He said the operator had sealed the incident report. He said he'd seen the report sealed. He said he'd looked at the file number on the folder when the operations manager had carried it past him in the office. He said he remembered the number. I asked him what the number was. He said 843-18. He said that was the number he'd seen. He said I should remember it because if what had just happened on our pad got written up, it was probably going to be filed against the same indexing system. I asked Gary if he had any theory about it. Gary looked at me for a while. He was the kind of man who chewed on a toothpick when he was thinking. He didn't have a toothpick that night. He rubbed his jaw and he said he didn't have a theory he wanted to say out loud. He said he'd spent a lot of years on these pads, and he'd seen more than one thing that didn't have an engineering explanation. He said the oldest guys he'd worked with, guys who'd started on rigs in the 1970s, had a few names for what happened on certain pads in certain parts of the basin. He said he wasn't going to repeat those names. He said the names didn't help. He said what helped was doing what he told us to do. Stay in your truck. Keep your radio off if you can. Wait for relief. Don't chase the voice. He said one more specific thing that I wrote down later. He said the voice doesn't work unless you answer it. He said he believed that. He said on the 6 years earlier pad, the 2 crew members who'd gone missing had both responded to voices on the channel. The ones who hadn't responded had stayed on the pad. He said he'd thought about that for a long time. He said the voice was an invitation, and if you didn't accept the invitation, nothing happened to you. He said he couldn't prove it. He said it was just a thing he'd noticed. We finished the shift in our trucks. The relief crew got there at 2:30 a.m. They were a 3-man crew instead of 2. That was not standard. Nobody said anything about it. They took our logs. They took our handhelds for tech review. They shook our hands. Gary drove us off the pad to the county road. He followed us to the highway. He did not turn back until we hit the interstate. I filed an incident report the next afternoon. It was routed to the operator and to our company. The file was coded 843-19, which was one number up from the number Gary had given me. The correlation was probably a coincidence and probably wasn't. I asked Linda about it the next week. She said she wasn't supposed to discuss other crews' incident reports. She said she would tell me, off the record, that my report was not the first she had forwarded to the operator's special operations desk in her 20 years at the service company. She said the desk existed for a reason. She said the company paid a small retention bonus to crews who worked incidents like mine and kept working afterward. The retention bonus showed up in my next paycheck. It was about $400. Dale got one too. About a month after the incident, a man I didn't know came into our Midland office and asked to speak with me. He was in his 50s, clean-shaven, wore a plain button-up shirt and khakis, and introduced himself as a consultant for the operator's safety and compliance group. He asked me to describe what had happened on the pad. I described it. He took notes in a legal pad. When I was done, he asked me one question. He asked whether, at any point during the incident, I had said Dale's name out loud into the radio. I thought about it. I said I had keyed the radio and said his name. The consultant underlined something in his notes. He thanked me. He left. I asked Linda about him later. She said she didn't know who he was. I think she did. Dale transferred to a different service company 6 months later. He said he'd had enough of flowback. He went into coil tubing, which is a different kind of service work, day shifts mostly, with bigger crews. We still get lunch when he's in Odessa. He has not said anything else about that night to me, and I have not asked. The pad is still active. The operator drilled 3 more wells on it 2 years after the incident. I have not worked the pad since. My company assigns me pads in the northern part of the basin now, closer to the New Mexico line. I asked for the reassignment and got it without having to explain. If you work flowback on a remote pad with a small crew, and if the coyotes you've been hearing all week suddenly stop for no reason, check on your partner in person, not on the radio. Drive to his truck or walk to his truck with your eyes on him the whole way. If your partner radios in from more than one bearing in a short interval, do not answer the radio. Go to his truck. If the same voice comes in from more than one direction, the voice is not the person. Drive with the headlights on high. Stay on the lit pad. Wait for the company man. And do not say your partner's name into the radio, because whatever's listening on the other end is collecting it, and it will use the recording the next time. Story 5, Channel 22. The new tower was picking up a frequency that shouldn't have carried a signal, and the voices on it were ours, having a conversation we hadn't had yet. I am not supposed to be telling anyone this. The carrier sealed the logs, and the engineer who pulled them was gone by the end of the month. I need to start by saying what the job was, because if you don't understand the job, you won't understand why the incident mattered. I work for a telecom contractor out of Phoenix that gets hired by the big wireless carriers to rebuild infrastructure after a disaster. Fire, flood, tornado. Our specific niche is restoration after wildfires, because in the American Southwest that's steady work. A fire burns through a stretch of country, takes out 3 or 4 cell towers, knocks down fiber hung on wooden poles, melts the plastic casings on the antennas. The carrier pays us to come in with crews, replace everything, and bring the tower back online. We're usually on site for a week to 10 days, sometimes longer if the backhaul fiber needs to be rerun. The fire that summer had taken out a tower on the Ponderosa Belt east of Flagstaff in Coconino National Forest country, on a section of Forest Service land that had burned hard. The ground was black. The trees were black. The sky had been full of ash for the first 2 weeks after the fire came through, and even after the ash settled, the air smelled like a cold fireplace for months. When our crew got there in late August, the soil was still warm in some patches, and there were still spots where stumps were smoldering 15 feet underground, the way old-growth roots will keep cooking long after the surface fire has passed. The Forest Service had green-lighted the carrier to restore the tower, because the tower served a stretch of interstate and a dispersed ranching community to the north, and nobody in that zone had had reliable cell coverage since the burn. The crew was 4 of us. Our foreman was a man named Ramon. Ramon had been a lineman since he was 19, which was about 25 years at that point, and had worked his way up through landline, then cable, then wireless. He was one of those men who could do any part of the job. He could climb, he could run the bucket, he could commission the radios, he could trench fiber, he could do the grounding. Ramon was also the kind of foreman who made sure his crew got home. That was the part I'd come to trust most about him. On previous jobs, I'd worked with foremen who would push past a weather call to finish an install. Ramon would not. Ramon had a list of decisions that he made the same way every time. That made him a man you could plan around. The other two on our crew were a younger lineman named Jared, late 20s, married with a toddler, and a ground tech named Tyler, 23, single. The kind of kid who'd come straight out of a trade program and had 6 months in the field. Jared was a good climber and a decent commissioner. Tyler was new and learning, and Ramon spent about a quarter of every shift teaching him. The site was a steel monopole, 180 feet, on a rise above a drainage that the fire had scoured clean. The original pole was intact because steel doesn't burn, but everything attached to it had been destroyed. Antennas, cabling, the radio cabinet at the base, the fiber patch panel, the backup battery enclosure, the generator. We'd been contracted to replace all of it and bring the tower back to carrier specifications. The work required trenching new fiber from the nearest surviving junction box, running new conduit up the monopole, mounting new antennas at 3-sector positions, wiring the radio cabinet, installing a new generator and a new battery enclosure, and commissioning the whole stack end-to-end with the carrier's network operations center in Dallas. We worked nights. The reason we worked nights was partly the heat, which on the exposed burn scar hit 105 during the day and cooked the silicon in the radio equipment before you could even get it seated. But it was also because the daylight was bad on the eyes. The burned pines around the site were all still standing. The fire had been hot enough to kill them, and had burned off the bark on the windward side of every trunk, but the trees themselves were vertical and upright, and silver black. Standing there in the middle of them during the day was disorienting. The shadows fell at angles that your mind didn't want to accept. We ran night shifts and slept during the day under tarps back at the staging yard. The staging yard was a flat patch of cleared ground about a quarter-mile down the access road from the tower site. We'd parked a fifth-wheel trailer there for sleeping, a portable generator for staging yard lights, a pickup truck each, and the bucket truck we used at the tower. The tower site itself got its own generator once we installed it, because the permanent carrier generator wasn't in yet. Between the staging yard and the tower site, a single set of diesel-colored ruts cut through dead pine. We drove it 12 times a night. For the first 4 nights, the work went normally. We got the trenching done, ran the new conduit, pulled fiber, mounted the antennas at the sector positions, ran the coax down to the cabinet. Commissioning was the last step. Commissioning is when you power up the new radio equipment, register it with the Network Operations Center, and test each band and each sector to make sure the tower is talking to the core network the way it's supposed to. It takes a few hours if nothing goes wrong. It can take days if something does. Commissioning started on the 5th night. Ramon ran it. He sat at a folding table at the base of the tower with a laptop, the laptop tied into the radio cabinet by a direct Ethernet cable, and a headset on. He was in voice contact with a network engineer in Dallas who was walking him through the sequence. The engineer in Dallas that night was a woman named Priya. Priya had worked with us before. She was steady and patient and knew our equipment inside and out. The sequence she was walking Ramon through was a standard one. Power up the radio cabinet. Verify cabinet temperatures. Bring up the sectors in order. Run a signal generator sweep across the license bands. Cross-check the reported signals with her side of the link. Run a test call from a handset to the tower, to the core network and back. Sign off on each check. Jared, Tyler, and I stood on the pad around the base while Ramon worked. We had handheld 2-way radios on our belts, set to channel 22, which was our crew work channel. Channel 22 was a frequency we leased as part of the company's business band allocation. It was our own private channel. It wasn't a licensed cellular band. It wasn't in the public safety spectrum. It was an ordinary itinerant VHF channel that the FCC assigned to commercial crews that needed short-range communications. We used it so we could talk to each other on the pad without tying up the cellular system we were supposed to be testing. That night, during the signal generator sweep, something came through on channel 22 that shouldn't have. Ramon noticed it first. He was at the laptop, running a sweep across the upper cellular bands, and he keyed his handheld and said to Jared to stand back from the cabinet for 60 seconds. He said it quietly. A normal instruction. Jared stepped back. Tyler and I were already back, 10 feet away at the ladder rack. Then, Channel 22 said Ramon's instruction again, in Ramon's voice, 2 seconds after Ramon had said it. All four of us heard it. I remember because Tyler laughed. He thought it was feedback. He said to Ramon that the handheld was echoing. Ramon looked at Tyler, and then at the rest of us, and then at the handheld on his belt. His handheld had not keyed. The transmit light was dark. His voice had gone through his mouth, into the air, into our ears directly, and then a copy of it had come through Channel 22 2 seconds later. Ramon took the handheld off his belt. He looked at the channel indicator. Channel 22. He looked at the rest of us. He told Jared to say something into his handheld. Jared keyed his radio and said his own name. His voice went out on Channel 22, came through our handhelds normally, and stopped. Ramon said something to us with his mouth, off the radio. He said, "What the hell was that?" Channel 22 said, 2 seconds later, "What the hell was that?" in Ramon's voice. Tyler stopped smiling. Ramon keyed his handheld and said to Priya on the headset that he had something strange on his work channel. Priya asked him to describe it. Ramon described it. Priya said that wasn't possible on their end. Channel 22 wasn't a frequency the tower equipment used. The tower equipment couldn't broadcast on Channel 22. The tower equipment couldn't receive on Channel 22 either. She said to continue the sweep. She said it might be local RF interference and to log it and move on. We logged it. We moved on. Ramon ran the next section of the sweep. He gave an instruction to Jared. Jared carried it out. 2 seconds later, Channel 22 repeated the instruction in Ramon's voice. Ramon gave the next instruction. 2 seconds later, Channel 22 repeated it. This continued for about 10 minutes. Every instruction Ramon said out loud, Channel 22 said back, 2 seconds delayed, in Ramon's voice, to an audience that was already hearing him with their ears. Ramon stopped the sweep. He stood up. He said to Jared, Tyler, and me to power the handhelds off. We powered them off. The air around the tower base got quiet in a way I hadn't realized it had been loud. Ramon said we were going to try an experiment. He said he was going to say something he had never said on the pad before, something random, something out of context. He said he was going to say the line from a book he read, his daughter at bedtime. He said he was going to say it once, then we were going to turn the handhelds back on and listen. He said the line. It was a line about a rabbit in a field. I recognized it from a children's book I remembered. He said it cleanly, at normal volume, with his mouth, nothing keyed. He turned his handheld back on. Channel 22 said the line about the rabbit and the field in his voice, about 40 seconds after he'd said it. Ramon sat down. Jared sat down too. Tyler looked like he wanted to sit down. I think I sat down. I don't remember. Priya in Dallas said on the headset that she could still hear us, and she was asking Ramon what was going on. Ramon told her. He told her the specific thing we'd just done with the rabbit. He told her what Channel 22 had said. He asked her if her end was recording. Priya said her end was recording. Her end always recorded commissioning calls. She said she could pull the audio, but her audio was of the headset channel, not of Channel 22. She said Channel 22 was our local channel, and nothing on her end could capture it. Ramon said we'd recorded ourselves. He pulled a small digital recorder out of his kit, the kind of voice recorder linemen sometimes use to take verbal field notes, and he set it on the table next to his handheld. He turned it on. He looked at us. He said nobody was to say anything that wasn't directly part of the commissioning. He said we were going to keep the pattern tight. We were going to keep running the sweep, and we were going to keep the recorder running, and we were going to see what Channel 22 did when we had a reference. We ran the sweep. Ramon gave an instruction. Channel 22 repeated it, 2 seconds behind. The recorder captured both. Ramon gave another instruction. Channel 22 repeated. The recorder captured both. We worked like that for about 20 minutes. Then the pattern changed. Ramon gave an instruction. Channel 22 did not repeat it. Instead, Channel 22 said something else. It said, in Ramon's voice, something about a cabinet temperature reading being out of spec. It named a specific reading. It said the reading in a sentence that was the kind of sentence Ramon might say. It said, for example, that the Western Sector amplifier was reading at 71 degrees Celsius, and he wanted a 30-minute cool down before proceeding. Ramon looked at his laptop. The cabinet temperatures were all nominal. The Western Sector amp was reading at 43 degrees Celsius. Nothing was out of spec. Ramon told Priya what the radio had just said. Priya said her telemetry showed the same reading Ramon was showing, 43 Celsius. Nominal, the radio was describing a temperature that was not the current temperature. Ramon went on with the sweep. He did not reference the false reading again. He did not repeat it. He kept the instructions tight and routine. About 6 minutes later, Ramon's laptop flagged a temperature warning on the Western Sector amplifier. The amp had climbed to 68 degrees. Priya confirmed on her end. Ramon called for a hold. He instructed Jared to open the cabinet and check the airflow on the Western amp. Jared went to the cabinet. The cabinet fan for the Western amp was running at reduced speed. A bearing had started to fail. Jared ran the backup fan, which was a redundant system, and the temperature began to drop. Within 5 minutes, the amp was back to nominal. Within 30 seconds of the amp coming back to nominal, Ramon said into the channel that the Western Sector amplifier was reading at 71 degrees Celsius, and he wanted a 30-minute cool down before proceeding. He said the exact sentence Channel 22 had fed him 6 minutes earlier. He said it because the amp had in fact just been at that temperature. His voice, live channel, delivering the words that the anomalous signal had delivered to us in advance. Channel 22 did not repeat the sentence. It had already said it. Ramon looked at the recorder. The recorder had captured the forward delivery and was capturing the live delivery. 2 copies of the same sentence in Ramon's voice, separated by 6 minutes and 40 seconds, with Channel 22's version coming first. He looked at me, he looked at Jared, he looked at Tyler. He said to power the handhelds off. We powered them off. He said we were going to stop commissioning for the night. He told Priya he'd call her back in the morning. Priya asked him if he was all right. He said he didn't know. He said he was going to consult with his crew and call back. He hung up. He closed the laptop. He said we were going to drive back to the staging yard and sit down and figure out what was happening. He said the work wasn't going anywhere. He said we were going to take the recorder with us. He said we were going to leave the handhelds off. I want to say clearly what I believed at that moment, because I've told this story to a couple people over the years, and the ones who push back on me usually push back on this. I was not scared yet. I was confused. I was professionally baffled. I had never heard of a propagation anomaly that could time shift a voice transmission. The physics of radio waves don't allow that. Sound reproduction, yes, with delay. Time-shifted prediction of speech, no. I thought we were being hoaxed. I thought somebody with a recording and a transmitter was fucking with us from somewhere nearby. We drove back to the staging yard in the bucket truck. Ramon drove. I rode passenger. Jared and Tyler rode in the cab of their own pickup, following. The access road was a mile of ruts through dead pine. The bucket truck's headlights threw long shadows across the black trunks. About halfway down the road, I looked in the passenger side mirror. I saw Jared's pickup following us, headlights on. I saw the rows of dead pines flickering past between us. Then, for a single frame of vision, I thought I saw a figure standing in the middle of the road, about 40 feet back from Jared's truck, inside our own dust cloud. A person, standing, wearing a high-visibility vest. The orange and silver striping caught our taillights. A hard hat, work boots, arms at the sides, standing in the middle of the access road. I blinked. The figure was gone. I told Ramon what I thought I'd seen. He slowed the bucket truck. He keyed the radio to Jared and asked Jared if he'd seen anything behind him. Jared said he hadn't. Ramon drove on. We got to the staging yard. We sat at the picnic table outside the fifth wheel. under the staging yard floodlights. Ramon set the digital recorder on the table. He played back segments from the night, the instructions, the delayed copies, the false temperature sentence, the cascade afterward. We all listened. We all heard the same thing. The recorder was a physical object that had recorded physical sound waves through a physical microphone in the open air of the commissioning pad. The sound waves had existed. They were not a hallucination. They were not the result of Ramon misremembering what he'd said. Jared said, "We should pull the tower offline until the carrier sent somebody to investigate." Tyler said he wanted to go home. He said it the way a 23-year-old says it, when he knows it sounds bad to say, but he can't help saying it. Ramon told him he understood. Ramon said he wasn't going to make Tyler work the rest of the commissioning if Tyler didn't want to. Ramon said nobody on this crew was going to work if they didn't want to. He said we were going to do one more thing. He said he was going to call Priya on the headset channel, not on a handheld, and he was going to explain what had happened, and he was going to request a formal stand-down on the site pending investigation by the carrier's RF engineering group. He said he was going to do this over the wire, not over radio, so that nothing could intercept it or mimic it. He said we were going to stay at the staging yard for the rest of the night. He went into the fifth wheel. He made the call. He came back out about 20 minutes later and said Priya was escalating. She was contacting the on-call RF engineer. The engineer would call us back within the hour. Priya had also pulled the recording of her end of the commissioning channel and would be preserving it as evidence. We sat at the picnic table. We drank coffee. We waited. The RF engineer called about 40 minutes later. His name was Barrett. I had met him once at a company training. He was in his 50s, worked out of the carrier's Dallas Engineering Center, had been doing commissioning and troubleshooting for over 30 years. Ramon took the call inside the fifth wheel on the hard line. He was in there for almost an hour. When he came out, he said Barrett was driving up from Phoenix in the morning to pull the equipment logs and inspect the site in person. Barrett had asked a lot of questions. Barrett had wanted specifics on what had been said on Channel 22 and when. Barrett had asked whether the recorded anomalies matched known RF phenomena. Ramon said Barrett had sounded, at one point, like he wasn't surprised by what Ramon was describing. Ramon said Barrett had asked one specific question that had stuck with him. Barrett had asked whether the voice on Channel 22 had ever said something that sounded like a question directed at a specific person on the crew by name. Ramon had said no. Barrett had said, "Good, that was good." We slept that day at the staging yard, with the handhelds and a metal ammo can, in Ramon's truck with the lid closed. We woke up at sundown. Barrett arrived at the staging yard at about 7 in the evening. He was driving a carrier-marked work truck. He got out, shook our hands, and asked to see the site. We drove back up the access road with him. He rode in the passenger seat of Ramon's truck. He had a laptop and a spectrum analyzer in a hard case. We worked through the night of the 6th shift with Barrett in control. He took possession of the digital recorder and sealed it in an evidence bag he brought with him. He brought up the tower equipment in safe mode. He ran his spectrum analyzer across every band we'd licensed. He ran it across bands we hadn't. Every time he turned to channel 22 on his analyzer, the screen showed clean spectrum. No anomalous traffic. No voices. The channel was quiet. He had us key our handhelds one at a time, saying pre-agreed phrases that none of us had said on the pad before. The phrases did not repeat back to us. The channel was clean. Barrett worked the site for about 5 hours. He found nothing unusual in the equipment. He found nothing unusual in the RF environment. He ran the commissioning sequence that Ramon had started the night before. It went through cleanly. Every instruction Ramon gave carried once and died. Nothing repeated, nothing preceded. By about 1 in the morning, the tower was fully commissioned and talking to the core network the way it was supposed to. Priya signed off from Dallas. We were done with the site. Barrett said his investigation was inconclusive. He said the anomalous behavior we'd reported was not reproducing, and he had no physical evidence of RF interference on channel 22 in the current spectrum. He said he would take the recorder and the equipment logs back to Dallas for further analysis. He said one other thing, quietly, to Ramon and me at the base of the tower before we left the site. He said he'd seen something similar on 2 other restoration jobs in his career. One in northern New Mexico, one in East Texas, both on burn scars, both after fires. He said both times the anomaly had shut off on its own, the way ours had shut off when he arrived. He said the engineering group had tried to publish a technical note about it once and the paper had been pulled before it went anywhere. He said it was not a thing the carrier wanted in its public record. He said we should log what we experienced, but he recommended we log it conservatively. Describe the delayed audio. Do not describe the predictive audio. Let him handle the predictive part. Ramon asked Barrett what he thought the voice had been. Barrett said he didn't have a technical answer. Ramon asked him if he had a non-technical answer. Barrett looked at the burned pines around us for a while. He said that on the East Texas site, the original tower had gone up in the 1960s, before the first of the fires on that stretch of country, and the crew who'd built it had reported a similar kind of anomaly during that first commissioning. The field notes from that first commissioning were in an archive somewhere. Barrett said he'd read them. He said the 1960s field notes described it the same way we had. Voice on channel 22. Delay of 2 seconds at first. Then predictive. Then a figure at the edge of the work light. Barrett said in the 1960s crew, one of the linemen had walked off into the burn that night, away from the pad toward the tree line, and had not come back. Barrett said the tower had then come up clean, and the anomaly had not returned, and the field notes had been filed. He said he'd read those notes twice in his career, once as training, once last year. He said he didn't know why he'd read them last year. We packed up, we drove back to the staging yard. Barrett stayed the night at the yard in his truck and drove back to Phoenix in the morning. About 6 weeks later, I called the carrier to ask Barrett a follow-up question. The receptionist said Barrett no longer worked for the company. She would not elaborate. I asked to be connected to someone in the RF engineering group who might have taken over his caseload. She said she could not transfer my call without a formal request in writing. I hung up. I made a formal request in writing. I received a reply 2 weeks later that said my inquiry had been received and would be handled at the company's discretion. I never received further reply. Priya in Dallas was still with the company, and I called her directly about 3 months later on her personal line because we'd exchanged numbers. She said she couldn't talk about the incident. She said the recordings from her end of the commissioning channel had been classified by the carrier's internal compliance group. She said she had not been told why. She said she'd been asked during an interview with compliance whether she had personally heard the anomalous transmissions. She'd said she hadn't because the transmissions were on channel 22 and she'd been on a landline. Compliance had thanked her. She said that was the last time she'd spoken to anyone about it in any official capacity. The tower we restored is still in service. Coverage on that stretch of interstate is back. The ranching community to the north has its service back. I drove through the area once, about 2 years after the incident, and I stopped the truck on a pullout and looked up at the monopole from across the drainage. It looked like any other cell tower. A steel stick with 3-sector antennas. I did not get out of the truck. Ramon is still a foreman. He works a different restoration contract now. He and I don't work the same crews anymore, which is partly scheduling and partly my choice. Jared went into residential fiber, which is a completely different line of work, and seems happier. Tyler left the industry. I heard from someone that he works at a community college now, teaching a welding certificate program. I think he's fine. I hope he's fine. I still carry a handheld on the job. I still work crew channels. I have never heard anything on channel 22 that wasn't supposed to be there. I have worked 3 more restoration jobs after burn scars since then. None of them did what that one did. Whatever the thing was, it did not follow me home. That is the main thing I want to say. It did not follow me home. The thing I am willing to say that was not in the carrier's logs, and that I would not have said until now, is this. The sentence about the western sector amplifier temperature was not the only predictive line channel 22 gave us that night. I counted 4, in the recorder playback we did at the picnic table. 3 of them, including the amp temperature, came true within the hour. The 4th one was a sentence Ramon never said. It was in Ramon's voice. It was about a person standing at the tree line. I will not tell you the exact words. I will tell you that Ramon did not say them that night, and he has not said them since, and the recorder had them on it in his voice, and Barrett sealed the recorder the next night before Ramon had the chance to listen to it a second time. I think about that 4th sentence. I do not want to hear it again. I also do not want Ramon to hear it again, which is part of why I do not work his crews anymore. He is a steady man. Steady men can be worn down if you play the right sentence back to them at the right time. I am not going to be on the crew when that happens, if it happens. That is the most honest thing I can say about why I changed my schedule. If you're commissioning a tower on fresh burned scar ground and your work channel starts repeating your instructions back to you with a delay, shut down the commissioning before the delay gets shorter. The delay getting shorter is the warning sign. Voice shift phenomena have been reported in carrier engineering files for over 60 years, but those files are not available to the crews in the field. You will not find them in your safety handbook. The rule is simple. If the recording knows what you're about to say, stop saying anything you haven't already said aloud. Power your radios off. Drive to the staging yard. Wait for the sun. The voice is collecting you. Do not give it any more to work with than it already has. Thanks for staying with me through all 5 of these. If you made it this far, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe so I can keep bringing you content like this, and comment the secret word popcorn so I know who made it to the end.